The first sound of the Paris morning, in the autumn of 1256, is a man walking the streets shouting that the water is hot. He is crying the baths. He goes out early before most of the city is up, when the air off the river still has the night in it, and his voice carries a long way between the houses, because at that hour there is very little to compete with it. A cart somewhere, a shutter, a dog that has been awake all night and has nothing to show for it. If the wind is coming the right way, you can smell the wood smoke from under the bathhouse floors before you hear the man selling what it heats. Lords, go to the baths and the steam rooms and do not delay. The water is hot. 2 deniers for the steam room, which is what 2 loaves of bread cost, and 4 for a bath you can sit down in. There are somewhere near 30 bathhouses inside these walls. The fires beneath them were lit in the dark by somebody who is already tired, and every hour the rooms stand empty is wood, burning for nothing. So he shouts. That is the job. Behind him, over the next hour or so, the rest of it starts up. Fresh herring, called by variety. Live small fish, still moving in the water they are carried in. Sea eels, goslings, pigeons, salt meat with garlic sauce. Peas and beans already cooked down soft. Garlic and onions and watercress. Cheese from Champagne and cheese from Brie. Butter and milk and grain. Apples, pears, walnuts, chestnuts, figs, raisins, eggs. Oil, vinegar, mustard. Men calling that they will mend whatever you are wearing. And running underneath all of it, at intervals, a cry of a different kind altogether. Bread, because the friars beg here and the hospitals beg here, and so do the students too poor to eat otherwise, and their begging has a tune to it as well. A great many people in this city have no fire of their own, which is why so much of what is being shouted has already been cooked by somebody else. We have not much changed that arrangement. We have only stopped shouting. We know the order of the morning because a man wrote it down. He was a jongleur, which meant he lived by performing for whoever would pay him, and his name was Guillaume de la Villeneuve. Around the year 1265, he set roughly 130 of the cries of Paris into verse, running them from first light through to the end of the day, and one copy of that poem came down through the centuries and sits in a library in Paris now. 2 leaves of parchment, and that is the whole of it. He put the baths first. Whatever else was in a Parisian morning, that was the sound he reached for when he sat down to write the city waking up. The place he was writing is an island in a river with 2 banks grown onto either side of it, and a wall around the whole arrangement. 253 hectares, call it a square mile, with 12 gates in it. On the island, a cathedral has been going up for 90-odd years and will not be finished for another 60. Nobody alive in Paris has ever seen it standing still. South of the river, up the hill, several thousand young men are arguing in Latin, most of them badly and a few of them brilliantly. North of it is the money, the meat, the market, and the noise. If you had been standing on the small bridge at that hour with the schools at one end of it and the cathedral scaffolding at the other, you would have found yourself stepping aside more or less constantly. Something like 1,200 people to the hectare in the middle of it, and not a great deal of room for any of them. This is the largest city in Christendom, and it is not large. There is a king here home, not quite 2 years from a crusade that ended with him a prisoner in Egypt, and shortly after he got back, he signed a law closing the taverns to anyone who actually lives in the city. The taverns are open. He has ordered the women off the streets, and the women are still on the streets, and the law has already begun, quietly, to change its mind about them. None of which makes this a lawless place. It makes it a place where the law and the street have an understanding, and both parties know the terms. Nobody in that morning came through it. The man crying the baths, the woman buying watercress with her hands already full, the boy who lit the fire under the bathhouse floor before dawn and went back to sleep. All of them were finished within a lifetime, and the ground they stood on has been pulled down and built over so many times since that you could walk it today and never know. What survived was the parchment, which was never meant to survive anything, and which lasted by the ordinary luck of being bound into the right book and then forgotten about. That is most of what we have of most people, not their names, a list of what they were shouting, and it turns out to be enough to stand inside a morning 770 years old and hear the thing working. There is no hurry in any of this. Everyone in it is safe now, in the way that the dead are safe, and you are warm, and it is tonight, and the morning we are about to walk into finished a very long time ago. And before we go down into it, one quiet thing. If you find yourself drawn to this kind of reading, slow, sourced, spent inside hours that have been over for a very long time, consider subscribing, and we will keep opening them. There is more in these lives than the histories have generally bothered to mention. And let us know in the comments where you are listening from tonight, your city, your time zone. It is a good thing to see how far a quiet hour travels. Now let us begin where anyone arriving would have begun, outside the wall at one of the 12 gates, waiting in the cold for somebody to unbar it. The road from the north comes down to the wall at a gate named for St. Denis. And at this hour, there are 8 or 9 people sitting against the stonework beside it, waiting. 2 of them have carts. One has geese, which he has been keeping quiet with some difficulty since about 3 in the morning. The rest arrived after dark, found the gate barred as it is barred every night, and have spent the hours since then outside the city with their backs to it, because there is nowhere else to be and nobody inside is going to open a gate for them at midnight. When it does open, it opens without ceremony. A bar comes off, one leaf swings, and the men who spent the night against the wall stand up stiffly and go in ahead of the carts, and the geese go in shouting. What they walk through is not a hole in a fence. The gate is a passage through masonry 3 meters thick at the base, with the weight of a tower over it, and the stone is close-fitted and pale, and only 60-odd years old, which in a city this age makes it practically new. Under the arch the sound changes for 4 or 5 paces. Footsteps come back off the stone, the geese get suddenly much louder. And then it opens out again, and you are on the street, and the street is already busy. The ground underfoot is paved, which is worth noticing, because most ground in most of Europe is not. About 70 years ago, the king had the main thoroughfares of Paris laid with stone, a job that took roughly a decade, and he had a shallow channel cut down the center of each one, so that rain would carry the worst of the street away in the general direction of the river. The system works about as well as you would expect. What it does mean is that this road, the one running south from the gate towards the water, is hard and dry enough to take a loaded cart in February, and that the lanes opening off it on both sides are not. Step off the main line and you are in mud that has been accumulating since the last hard frost. If you were to stand on the same spot today, you would be standing several feet above the men with the geese. Cities rise. Rubbish, rubble, fire, fill, new paving over old paving, century after century, until the 13th century surface is a thing archaeologists reach by digging. The road is still there and still runs where it ran. It is simply further down. The wall those people just came through was built by a king who was leaving. In 1190, Philip Augustus took the cross and went east, and before he went, he ordered Paris enclosed. A decision that reads very differently once you know he was about to be a long way away for a long time. The work outlasted his absence, and then some. The right bank took about 20 years, the The left bank, another 15. What he got for it was 2 faces of dressed limestone with rough stone and mortar packed between them, 6 meters high, or nearer 8 where the parapet survives, and 12 principal gates. At the western end, where the wall meets the river, he put a fortress with a moat around it and a great round tower in the middle, which was not a palace then and was not meant to be pleasant. It was there to watch the water. Going south, the street thickens. This is the trading half of the city, and the market is somewhere off to the right of you, audible before it is visible. Against the head of the bridge stands the great butchery, and the streets immediately around a medieval butchery are exactly what you are now imagining, only warmer. Beside it sits the Châtelet, a squat royal fortress straddling the road, through which everything crossing the river has to pass, and inside which a great deal of unpleasant business is done. This morning, it is simply a thing you walk under, the way people walk under it every day, without looking up. Then the river and the bridge has houses on it. Not a bridge with a view. A bridge with a street on it, shops built out over the water on both sides, so that crossing means walking down a covered lane and getting perhaps 2 glimpses of the Seine through the gaps between buildings. The changers work here. Their tables are out early, and the tables are covered in silver, all of it small. This is the thing about money in this city that is genuinely hard to hold in the head. There is no large coin. The livre that people quote prices in does not exist as an object and never has. It is a way of saying 240 pennies, in the same way that a dozen is a way of saying 12. The sou is likewise a way of speaking. What actually exists, what is actually on those tables and in those purses, is the denier, a small, thin silver penny, and its half. A great coin worth a shilling's worth of them is still 10 years away from being struck. So when a chronicler tells us that a relic cost 135,000 livres, nobody in this century ever saw such a sum in the way we would picture it. They saw carts. They saw sealed bags, weighed rather than counted, because counting was not a serious option. The whole enormous financial apparatus of the largest city in the West is running on pennies, and the men on this bridge spend their working lives turning one kind of penny into another and taking a sliver for it. You have almost certainly crossed at this point yourself. The bridge is not the same bridge. Bridges here were carried away by floods with some regularity, and this one has been rebuilt more than once. But a river narrows where it narrows, and the crossing has been in this place for as long as there has been a city to cross to. On the far side is the island, and the island is a building site. The cathedral has been going up for 93 years. Everyone working on it this morning was born into a world where it was already unfinished, and everyone born here today will die before the last of the chapels goes on. What that means in practice for the people who live in its shadow is stone dust in everything. Carts arriving with limestone at hours that suit the carters, hoisting gear creaking overhead, and the particular ringing sound of a mason's chisel going all day, every working day, for a lifetime. Around it are the cloister where the canons live, the hospital where a great many of this city's poor will eventually die, and at the western end, behind its own walls, the royal palace. Inside those palace walls, 8 years old and by a distance the newest thing on the island, stands a chapel with almost no wall left in it, the stone reduced to the minimum that will hold glass up. It was not built to hold a congregation. It was built to hold an object, and it was built by the king who currently owns this city. And there is a great deal more to say about what he paid for the object and what that says about him. For now, it is simply the brightest building in Paris, and you can see the light coming off it from the water. Across the second bridge, smaller and older and more often destroyed, and the ground begins to climb. The change is immediate, and it is mostly a change in the voices. There are schools at the foot of this hill and more of them all the way up it, and the streets are suddenly full of young men who are not from here, arguing in a language none of them speak at home. How many people are in this city on this morning is a question we cannot properly answer, and it is worth being honest about why. The oldest real count from Paris is a register of hearths, households, not heads. And it was drawn up 70 years after the morning we are walking through. It gives a little over 61,000 hearths, which sounds precise until you ask what a hearth is. A hearth might be one man in a rented upper room. A hearth might be a merchant, his wife, their 6 children, his widowed mother, 3 apprentices, and 4 servants. Choose your multiplier, and you can have a Paris of 200,000 people, or a Paris of half that. And the argument over which number to choose has been running among historians for a century and is not settled. What can be measured from a tax roll is how tightly packed the centre was, and the answer is as tightly as anywhere in Europe. Beyond that, we are guessing, and it is better to say so than to pick a number and let it harden. By the time the hill levels out, you have crossed the whole of it, wall to wall, gate to gate, with a river in the middle, about half an hour at the pace of a man carrying something. That is the part that resists belief, and it is the same correction every large city eventually delivers to anyone who arrives, having only heard of it. The place is smaller under the feet than it was in the head. It is also, invariably, far fuller. Everything that this city is, the schools, the crown, the money, the trades, the cathedral, the hospital, the courts, the market that feeds it all, is packed into ground you could walk around the edge of before lunch, and almost none of it happens on the road we have just come down. The through street is for arriving on. The city itself is off it, in the lanes, and if you turn now out of the light into one of them, it narrows within 10 paces to something 2 people cannot comfortably pass in, and it goes dark overhead. And 40 feet in there is a door with a worn step in front of it, and someone already awake behind it. The reason it goes dark overhead is a tax. Houses in this city are assessed on the ground they stand on. The footprint, the square of earth the building occupies, and nothing at all is charged for what happens above that square. So the ground floor is kept as small as it can usefully be, and the first floor is built out a foot or 2 past it on projecting beams, and the second floor is built out past the first, and by the time you reach the 3rd or 4th story, the fronts of the houses on opposite sides of a lane like this one have come close enough that a man on one side could pass a jug to a man on the other without either of them leaning very far. There were structural arguments for it too. A floor cantilevered out past its supports is a stiffer floor, and the builders knew that, as well as they knew the tax. The 2 reasons were never in competition. They simply pointed the same way. There is nothing medieval about the thinking. Any rule that measures one thing hands over everything in the directions it does not measure, and people locate those directions almost at once. We still build into them. We have only changed which dimension is free. What it costs is light, and what it risks is everything. Down at ground level in a lane 4 stories deep and 8 feet wide, the sun arrives for perhaps an hour at noon in June and never arrives at all between November and February. And when a fire starts in a street whose upper floors are nearly touching, it does not stay in one house. It walks along the top. The house itself is a frame of oak with the gaps between the timbers filled. Stone rubble in mortar, sometimes brick, sometimes a lattice of sticks daubed over. And the frame is the building. The stone is only there to keep the weather out of the spaces. The doorway you would come in by is low enough that a tall man learns quickly to duck without thinking about it, because the shop front takes the height and the door takes what is left. Windows are small, and there are not many of them, and almost none of them have glass in them. Glass is for churches and for people with more money than sense. What an ordinary window has is a shutter, and behind the shutter perhaps a stretched cloth soaked in oil, which lets through a weak brown light and keeps out most of the wind, and which you cannot see through at all. You know the particular quality of a room with the shutters closed on a bright day. Not dark exactly, but not usable either, so that you stop attempting anything that requires looking closely at it. That was the ordinary indoor condition of the 13th century for most of the daylight hours, in most of the rooms in this city. It is one of the reasons the working day ended when the light did. The ground floor is the shop, or the workshop, or the stall the family lives off. The family lives above it, up a stair that is steep and narrow and turns, because a wide staircase is floor area nobody can sleep in. If you had put your head round that worn door and gone up, the first thing you would have noticed is how little is in the room. We know what was in these rooms largely because of what people troubled to list when they died, and the lists are short. A chest, a pot, and a second smaller pot. A trestle and a board that becomes a table at mealtimes and stops being one afterwards. A lamp or a candle if the household is doing well, since tallow costs money and the smoke of it gets into the wool. Some bedding. And a bed, which is not a small item on the list, but very often the largest single thing the household owns. That is worth sitting with, because it does not survive into the modern imagination at all. A bed in this century is a serious asset. It is bequeathed by name, itemized down to its parts and handed on deliberately. When the canons of the cathedral were placed under an obligation to endow the hospital across the square, the obligation was specified exactly like that. On retiring or on dying, each of them was to leave a bed, meaning the mattress, the pillow, and the sheets, listed separately, because each of those things was worth listing. People slept several to a bed as a matter of course, and not only children, and not only the poor. It was warmer, and it was what there was. 40 paces down the same lane, the arithmetic changes completely. A merchant's house here has a hall in it, and a chamber to withdraw to at the end of the hall, and a room given over entirely to storing and mending cloth, hangings, table linen, bedding, clothes, with the sewing done in it. It may well have a courtyard behind, and if it does, it may have a well in the courtyard. And a household with its own well is a household with hours in the day that other households do not have, because everything else depends on water, and water is somewhere else. It comes from the river mostly, or from wells, or from a handful of public fountains fed by a channel that brings it in from higher ground outside the wall. None of those places is your kitchen. Someone has to go and stand and wait and come back. And the someone, overwhelmingly, is a woman or a child, and they will do it several times before the day has properly started. Anyone who has carried something heavy up more than one flight of stairs knows that the weight is not really the problem. The problem is the third trip. A household of 6 on a 4th floor is a household that spends a meaningful fraction of its waking life moving water up a staircase, and then, later, moving it back down again in a rather worse condition, or simply putting it out of the window into the lane and hoping. Fire is the other daily arithmetic, and it runs the same way. Fuel arrives in this city by cart and by river, and is bought, not gathered, which means that every hour a fire burns is money going up a chimney that may not even be a chimney. The first job of the morning is finding out what happened overnight. If the embers were banked properly, raked together and covered over with their own ash so that they smoulder without consuming anything. Then there is a red heart under the grey when you push it aside, and the day begins easily. If they were not, or if the wind found a gap, you are on your knees in a cold room with flint and steel and a little dry tinder, and it takes as long as it takes. The alternative is to go and borrow fire from a neighbour, which works, and which nobody enjoys because it is a public admission that you let it go out. Now put those two together. Water is heavy and far away, fuel costs real money. And you can work out for yourself why nobody in this lane is heating a bath at home. To fill a tub deep enough to sit in at home means carrying it up in buckets and then burning through fuel you have paid for to bring it to a temperature that will not have survived the third bucket. Almost nobody does it. What exists instead is an industry. A survey taken a generation after this morning counted 27 bathhouses in Paris, and something over 30 are known across the century. Real premises with real fires under them, offering a wooden tub lined with cloth and filled hot, or a steam room, or both, with someone to bring you the water, and someone else to bring you something to eat while you sit in it. The prices we quoted at the top of the morning are the reason they are full. It is cheaper to buy hot water from a man whose whole business is boiling it than to make your own. If you have ever come in from genuine cold and lowered yourself into hot water, you already understand the entire economics of it without needing another word from us. The bathkeepers were a trade like any other, with sworn rules, and those rules survive because roughly 10 years after this morning, somebody sat down and wrote out the customs of every craft in Paris in a single book. One of the bathkeeper's clauses states that no member of the trade shall maintain brothels in his bathhouse, by day or by night. Rules get written against things that are already happening. Nobody legislates against a practice nobody has thought of. So that single line tells us, more reliably than any chronicler complaining about the morals of the age, that some of these places were running brothels on the upper floor, and that enough of them were doing it that the trade itself concluded it had better put something in writing. Not to stop it necessarily, but to be able to say afterwards that it had been forbidden. Back in the room above the shop then, with the shutter open now and the brown light coming in and the fire caught and someone on the stairs. There are thousands of rooms like it inside these walls, and a great many of them, particularly on the far side of the river and up the hill, have a young man in them who is not from Paris, does not speak French at home, pays rent to a family who find him irritating, and is about to go out and spend the day arguing in Latin about something his landlord would not consider work at all. In the last week of February, 1229, the woman governing France was handed a complaint about an unpaid bar bill. Blanche of Castile was regent, and had been for 3 years, and would be again. She was competent, devout, and not remotely sentimental, and this was very far from the largest thing on her desk. What had happened was this. It was Shrove Tuesday, the last day before Lent, which is a day for eating and drinking everything that is about to become forbidden, and a party of students had gone out beyond the wall to do it, because wine sold outside the city gates had not paid the duty charged on wine coming in, and was therefore cheaper. At some point in the evening there was an argument about the reckoning. Nobody in any surviving account comes out of the argument well. The innkeeper and his neighbours settled it by beating the students out of the building and some distance down the road. If you have ever agreed to something at 11 at night that looked substantially worse by 7 the following morning, you already know what happened next. The students came back the day after, with friends and with clubs, broke into the place, opened the barrels, and worked their way through the surrounding houses on general principle. This time the complaint went upward, and the regent gave the townspeople what they asked for, and soldiers were sent into the meadows on the edge of the city to deal with it. Students were killed. How many is not agreed. The numbers in the sources range from a handful upward. And whether any of the dead had been in the tavern on either night is a question the record does not answer at all. It is likely that some of them had not. That is generally how it goes when armed men are sent to punish a crowd, and it is worth saying plainly rather than smoothing over, because the killing is the hinge on which everything after it turns. What happened after it was that the university stopped. Not a demonstration, not a petition. The masters suspended their lectures, and then they left, physically left, with their students behind them, for Angers and Orléans and Toulouse, and some of them across the water to a small English town that was very glad to have them. Teaching in Paris did not resume for more than 2 years. The intellectual centre of Latin Europe simply switched itself off and walked out of the city, over an argument about a bar bill, and stayed off until it got what it wanted. It got rather a lot. In 1231, the Pope intervened with a document that opens by calling Paris the mother of the sciences, and which confirmed that the masters could set their own statutes, govern their own membership, and, this is the part that mattered, suspend lectures again whenever they judged themselves wronged. The right to strike was written into the constitution of the university by the papacy, because of a fight in a bar. That was 27 years before the morning we are standing in. Everyone teaching in Paris now remembers it. So does everyone in Paris who has ever had a student living upstairs. The reason a tavern brawl could escalate so far, and the reason the killings were understood as an outrage rather than as policing, comes down to a legal fact that has almost entirely fallen out of the modern picture of this century. Students were clerics, not priests, not monks, not necessarily religious in any sense you would recognize, but tonsured, a small shaved circle on the crown of the head, and therefore, in law, members of the clergy. And clergy were not subject to the ordinary courts. The practical consequence is enormous. The provost's men could not properly arrest a student, could not try him, and above all, could not hang him. Church courts did not shed blood. A young man who committed something serious in the streets of Paris would, at worst, find himself before an ecclesiastical judge, whose available punishments ran to fines, penance, imprisonment, and expulsion from the schools. The arrangement has left a fossil behind in the phrase benefit of clergy, which you may have run into without ever knowing what it originally bought. So here is the situation that ordinary Parisians were living inside. Somewhere between several thousand and a good many thousand young men. The number is another thing we cannot pin down. Most of them foreign. Most of them between 15 and 25. Most of them carrying a knife because everyone carried a knife. Living in rented rooms among families who could do nothing legal to them whatsoever. Not much. There was no police force in the sense we would mean. There was the watch, and the watch was mostly tradesmen taking their turn. They did not even arrive as a single body. The university was organized into nations by where you came from, and the nations were not social clubs. They were legal corporations with elected officials, common funds, patron saints, and the power to vote. There were 4 of them, and the boundaries were drawn loosely enough that the one called English absorbed the Germans and most of Northern and Eastern Europe, which will tell you something about how seriously the geography was taken. What the nations mainly did when they were not voting was despise each other. We have a catalogue of it, and the catalogue is one of the most enjoyable documents to survive from the medieval schools. It was written by a churchman named Jacques de Vitry, who studied in Paris and afterwards could not stop himself describing what the place had been like. The honest caveat has to come with it. He died in 1240, and he is remembering a Paris a good 20 or 30 years before the one we are walking through. We use him anyway, because the nations were still in place, the arguments were still running, and things this deeply established do not evaporate in a generation. But he is a witness to the shape of the thing, not to this particular morning, and we would rather say so than quietly pretend otherwise. They said the English were drunkards and had tails. They said the sons of France were proud, soft, and turned out like women. The Germans were obscene at table. The Normans could not stop boasting, and the Bretons were unreliable and still somehow being reproached for the death of Arthur, which had occurred, if it occurred, a very long time before anyone in the room was born. Lombards were grasping. The men of Brabant were arsonists and cutthroats, and the Flemish, according to whoever thought this one up, were soft as butter. De Vitry's own summary of where all this ended is 4 words long, from words to blows. You will have heard living versions of every single one of those, from people who would be genuinely startled to learn how old the format is. The teaching itself happened in hired rooms, in the halls of the schools, and, when the weather allowed and the room did not, outdoors, in the street. Students sat on the floor. Specifically, they sat on straw, which was spread over the boards or over the ground, and which was cheap and warm, and had the additional effect of removing the question of who sat where. There are no benches to be given out in order of rank if there are no benches. One street on that hill became so completely identified with the practice that it ended up named for the straw, though the name does not settle into the records for another 40-odd years. What is here already, on this morning, is the straw. If you had come in late to one of those rooms in January, the first thing you would have registered is the cold, and the second is that almost nobody has a book. Books are copied by hand and cost what a horse costs. The master has the text. The master reads it aloud, slowly, and comments on it as he goes, and the students write what they can and remember what they cannot. And this is the reason a medieval education takes so many years and produces such astonishing memories. Lectures in winter began before it was properly light, by candle, because the day had to be used. And all of it had to be paid for by people who overwhelmingly could not pay for it. A very few students were rich. Some held a church living somewhere that sent money. The rest depended on whatever could be extracted from home, which meant writing letters, which meant a problem, because composing a formal letter in Latin is a skill, and most 15-year-olds did not have it. So a small industry grew up around it. There were professional letter writers, and there were model books, collections of specimen letters, laid out by situation, which you adapted to your own circumstances. The largest single category in those collections, across every surviving example, is the request for money. The models follow a shape that has not aged a day. They open by assuring the reader that the student is applying himself to his studies with the greatest possible diligence. They move on to the condition of his clothing and to the price of everything in the city, which is outrageous, and to his lodging, which is inadequate. And then, having established all of that, they arrive at the point. The best dated collection of this kind we have is actually an English one, put together around the end of the 1240s, which means we are borrowing it across the Channel. Though the schools of Paris and the schools of England were one continuous world with the same students moving between them, so the loan is not a large one. The templates existed because the letter was difficult to write, and it was difficult for precisely the reason it is still difficult. Nobody in 800 years has discovered a graceful way to ask the people already paying for you to pay somewhat more. None of which was the slightest comfort to the man who owned the house. He had been up since before dawn. He had a workshop on the ground floor, and everything he was going to earn that day depended on something the young man upstairs had probably never thought about once. Whether the light outside was good enough yet to work by. The first thing that happens on a working street, once there is enough light to see the far end of it, is that the shutters come down. They come down rather than up. A shop front here is a wide opening with a hinged board across it, fixed at the bottom, and in the morning that board is lowered until it lies flat and horizontal, propped from beneath, at which point it stops being a shutter and becomes the counter. The shop opens by turning part of itself into furniture. Stand in the lane at the right moment, and you can hear it happen along the whole street in the space of a few minutes. A sequence of flat wooden knocks as the boards come down and the props go in, one after another, the sound of a city deciding that the day has started. Deciding is the right word because nothing has told them. There is no bell for this. Whether the light is good enough to work by is a judgment, made fresh every morning by people whose earnings depend on getting it right. And it is not a judgment anyone in Paris has an instrument to help them with. Too early and you are burning candles you have paid for. Too late and you have lost an hour of the only free thing in the whole enterprise. And the judgment is not merely practical. At the other end of the day, it is law. Most of the trades of this city were forbidden to work after dark. Not discouraged, forbidden, with penalties, and with men whose job it was to come and look. What makes the rule genuinely surprising is the reasoning behind it, because the reasoning is not the one a modern ear reaches for. Nobody was protecting the workers. The stated ground is that artificial light is not sufficient for good work. That you cannot see well enough by a candle or an oil lamp to do anything fine, and that therefore anything produced by that light is likely to be substandard. Night work was banned because night work was assumed to be bad work, and bad work sold as good work is fraud. The rule protects the customer. The worker going home in the dark is a side effect. There is a certain hard sense in it. Regulating quality is difficult and slow. You would have to examine everything. Regulating hours is easy because anyone can see whether a lamp is lit at the back of a workshop at 10 at night. So the trades did what regulators have always done when the thing they actually care about is hard to observe. They found something adjacent that was easy to observe and policed that instead. We have never stopped doing it, and mostly for the same reason. Which brings us to the part that turns the whole picture upside down. Some trades were exempt. The goldsmiths were exempt. So were the barrel makers, the men who made mail shirts, the sculptors, the bow makers, the mercers who dealt in fine cloth and small wares. And this is in the record, and we would not have dared invent it. The men whose craft was making hats out of peacock feathers. These trades were permitted to work into the night, and the same trades were also excused from taking their turn on the watch, and from some of the restrictions that governed everybody else's feast days. Read that list again with modern instincts, and it looks like a catalogue of who was being exploited. It is the opposite. Exemption was a privilege. It had to be negotiated, and it was held by the crafts strong enough to negotiate it. The ones with money, standing, and the ear of somebody who mattered. The right to keep your lamp burning after dark was something you had to be powerful enough to win. So was the right not to spend 3 weeks of the year patrolling the streets at night for nothing. What went on behind those counters when the boards came down was not divided the way we divide it now. There was no back office and no shop floor. The workshop was the shop. Whoever made the thing sold the thing, usually within a few feet of where it had been made, often with the customer watching the making, which is a considerable discipline on a craftsman and was meant to be. If you stood at that counter, you could see the bench, the tools, the apprentice, and the state of the floor, and you could form your own view about whether you wanted to buy anything. The scale of it is easy to underestimate. Counts made in the decades after 1300, so a good half-century past the morning we are in, which is the nearest we can get. Put something like 200 stonemasons in this city, 300 goldsmiths, and 400 master weavers in wool. Master weavers, not weavers. Each of those masters stands on top of a household of journeymen, apprentices, and family labour that does not appear in the number at all. And a very great deal of that invisible labour was female, which brings us to a claim about this century that has been repeated so often it has worn a groove. The claim is that medieval women had no economic life, that they were in the house, and the house was not the economy. It is not a small distortion. It is close to the exact inverse of what the records show. Of roughly 100 crafts whose rules were eventually written down in Paris, 5 were headed by women outright, with their own statutes, their own sworn officers, and their own apprentices. 5 out of 100 is not equality, and we are not going to pretend it is. But 5 is not 0. And the far more important figure is the other one. Women appear in most of the remaining 95. Something like a third of them worked in food and clothing, which is the part everybody expects. The other 2/3 worked at very nearly everything men worked at. The silk trades were female almost throughout and had the vocabulary to prove it. Separate named specialisms for the women who threw the thread. The women who combed the raw silk, the women who spun gold thread, the dyers, the makers of ribbon and lace, the weavers. The embroiderers of Paris, when somebody eventually counted them, came to about 100 people, and 3/4 of them were women. Establishing all of this has meant going through tax rolls and craft statutes line by line, name by name, which is slow and unrewarding work, and the historian who has done more of it than anyone is Sharon Farmer. What comes out of it is not a story of hidden equality. Women were paid less for the same work, were mostly barred from the top of the crafts they staffed, and were the first to be pushed out when a trade tightened its entry. What comes out of it is simply that they were there, in enormous numbers, doing the work. And that a version of this century in which they are not there has been assembled by people who did not look. If you have ever done the same small movement with your hands for a full working day, you know the specific fact about this work that no statute records. It hurts. Silk throwing, embroidery, fine goldsmithing, weaving. These are hours of tiny repeated precision, in bad light, in a cold room, and the people doing them were doing them from childhood, and their hands and their eyes went early. That is what the working life cost, and softening it would be a kind of lying. The structure of that life ran master, journeyman, apprentice, and the direction of travel was supposed to be upward. In practice, the journeyman stage was where a great many people stopped. Masterships were limited in number, entry was expensive, and the sons of masters had advantages that were never written down as advantages. A man could be 35 years old, extremely good at his trade, and still be working for somebody else's household with no prospect of anything else. Enforcement of all of it fell to sworn men chosen from inside each trade. Craftsmen, not officials, who took an oath and then walked their own colleagues' shops. They checked the hours. They checked the quality of the material and the marks on the finished goods and the number of apprentices, and whether anyone was doing something at night that they had no business doing at night. Being inspected by a rival who has known you for 20 years is a particular experience, and it was designed to be. None of which, on the morning we are standing in, exists anywhere in writing. That is the thing worth ending on. Every rule described here, the hours, the exemptions, the marks, the apprentices, the women's crafts and their statutes, lived entirely in the heads of the men and women who kept it. It passed from father to son, from master to apprentice, by being said. Then, a few years after this morning, a man named Etienne Boileau took charge of Paris, having done the same job in Orléans, and discovered that he could not do it. Disputes came to him constantly, and there was nothing to decide them by. So he sent word to every trade in the city, telling each of them to set down its own customs in writing. And when the answers came back, he checked them, approved them, and had the whole lot bound into a single book. Which means that almost everything we know about how 100 Paris crafts worked survives because one administrator found his job impossible. It also means, and this is worth holding on to, that what we have is what the trades said about themselves, in writing, to a royal officer. Not one word of it is disinterested. He was not the only man walking these streets with authority that morning. The others answered to nobody in the trade at all, and what they could do to you did not stop at a fine. In the market there is a wooden frame set on a raised platform, with holes cut in it for a head and 2 hands, and it stands there on ordinary days, whether or not anybody is in it. The point of the thing is not pain. A few hours in it is uncomfortable and no worse, and the authorities of this city had access to a great deal worse if pain had been the object. The point is that people look at you. You are put up above the level of the crowd, in the one place in Paris where absolutely everybody comes, at the hour when they come, and you are left there, and your neighbours and your customers and your competitors walk past and see you, and do not have to say anything at all. That works because of how small this world is. A man's living here rests on his name being good in about 4 streets. He is known to the people he buys from, the people he sells to, the sworn men of his own trade, and the priest of his parish, and there is nowhere else for him to go and start again. The guilds of the next town are shut to strangers, and the countryside has no use for a man who cuts leather. An hour on that platform reaches every single person whose opinion determines whether he eats. It is astonishingly cheap to administer, and it can finish somebody, and both of those facts were understood perfectly well by the people who used it. Which raises the question of who those people were. Criminal justice in Paris belonged to the provost, a royal officer holding the king's authority over the city, with the courts, the prison, and the sergeants under him. And here is the fact about the office in these particular years that changes the shape of everything else. The man holding it had bought it, not bribed his way into it. Bought it openly in a transaction the crown recorded, because the provostship of Paris was farmed. Farming an office means what it means in agriculture. You pay the crown an agreed sum up front for the right to work the office and take its yield, and the yield of the provostship was money, fines, fees, court dues, the 1,000 small charges that attach themselves to the administration of a large city. Whatever you could extract above the price you paid was yours to keep. Whatever you failed to extract came out of your own pocket. So the man deciding whether you were guilty had a direct and calculable financial interest in the answer. The obvious word for that is corruption, and the obvious word is not quite right, which is worth slowing down for. A farmed office in the 13th century is not a failure of the system. It is the system, and it was solving a real problem. The Crown of France in these years had no salaried civil service, no reliable machinery for collecting money at a distance, and no way of auditing an officer 6 days' ride away. What it had was an immediate and permanent need for cash. Selling the revenue of an office converted an uncertain future income into a certain present one, transferred all the risk of collection to somebody else, and required no bureaucracy whatsoever. As financial engineering, it is elegant. The elegance was paid for entirely by whoever came before the court. This does not last. Within a few years of the morning we are standing in, the king puts the provostship into the hands of a salaried officer who can be dismissed, who pays the revenues into the treasury rather than into his own chest, and who is answerable for what he does. And the first man appointed under the new arrangement is the same administrator from Orléans who ended up writing down the customs of every trade in Paris. But that is 1261, and this is not, and none of it has happened yet. On this morning in this city, the judge is a businessman and the court is his investment. He sat at the fortress on the north bank that everything crossing the river has to pass, the squat one, guarding the bridge, and inside it were the court, the offices, and the prison. The prison had 3 grades, and the grade was the sentence. At the top were common rooms shared above ground with light and with other people in them, and a prisoner with money could pay for better food and better company, and pass through the whole experience more or less intact. Below those were cells called secret, held alone. And below those, at the bottom, were the pits, underground, unlit, and reserved for whoever had run out of both money and friends. Much of what is written about the worst of those pits comes from a great deal later, when the building had acquired a reputation and writers had begun to enjoy describing it, so we would not lean too hard on the more theatrical details. The 3 grades themselves are solidly attested, and the 3 grades are the point. Where you were put depended far less on what you had done than on what you had. If you were taken in, then the question that determined how the next months would go was not whether you were guilty. It was which floor. The building came down 200 years ago, and the ground it stood on is now a square with a fountain in it and one of the busiest interchanges in Paris underneath. The name survived, which is the usual way of these things. A little castle, which is what the word means and what the building had once been. It is entirely possible to change trains under the floor of it several times a week without ever having wondered. What the law could actually do to a person ran up a scale, and most of the scale is money. Fines, forfeitures, damages, the confiscation of goods and tools. Above money came exposure, which is where the frame in the market comes in. Above exposure came mutilation, which was used for a small number of offences, and used deliberately because it is a punishment you carry on your face for the rest of your life, and everyone who meets you can read it. Blasphemy, under this king, was punishable by mutilation of the lips, and at the top was death by hanging. And hanging was for theft as readily as for killing. That last stretch of the scale did not apply to everybody. Clergy, which, as we have seen, included every tonsured student on the hill, went to church courts, and church courts did not shed blood, and the resentment that fact generated in the ordinary population of this city was permanent. We know about the lips from a man who loved this king. That is what makes the detail worth having. Jean de Joinville had gone on crusade with him, had been captured alongside him, and wrote his account of him as an old man half a century afterwards, with the explicit purpose of helping to establish that the king had been a saint. He was not a hostile witness. He was very nearly the opposite of one. And he wrote the branding down anyway, along with the king's own remark that a layman who hears the faith insulted should answer only with a sword, driven in as far as it will go. Which Joinville reports without visible discomfort, as an illustration of the man's seriousness. What a friendly witness happens to mention is very often more useful than what an enemy alleges, and we will be coming back to him. At night, the arrangement changed hands entirely. There was a royal watch, and there was the watch kept by the trades, and the trades watch is the one that mattered for most streets. Every craft in the city took its turn, 3 weeks at a stretch, unpaid, which is exactly why exemption from it was a privilege worth negotiating for. The men who walked your lane at 2 a.m. were a cooper, a shoemaker, and somebody's journeyman, carrying sticks and a lantern, having done a full day's work and facing another one at first light. The chains came out at dusk, iron chains drawn across the ends of streets and stretched over the water, so that a city which had spent the day entirely open closed itself in sections, and moving through it after dark meant either having business or explaining yourself. If you had heard them coming up the lane in the small hours, what you would have heard first is not authority. It is 3 tired men, one of whom is talking, because nobody walks around a dark city in silence. Every city has always solved this the same way, by locating somebody who would much rather be asleep and giving them a reason to be awake instead. The reasons have changed. The arrangement has not. And it is worth being clear-eyed about how much protection this actually bought, because the answer is not a great deal. A shoemaker with a stick is not a police force. He can raise a shout, he can hold a chain, he can be a witness in the morning. Against a determined group, he can do very little, and against the wrong people, he will not try. The security of an ordinary household in this city rested on a door, a neighbor, and the general expectation that most people, most nights, are not going to do anything, which is roughly where the law stopped. It could take your goods and your liberty, and in the end, your life. There was one thing it could not touch at all, a thing 2 people could do in a room by themselves, without a priest, without a witness, without their families knowing, that would bind them to each other for as long as they both lived, and that no court in Christendom had the power to undo. What it took was a sentence in the present tense, not a ceremony, not a document. 2 people in a room or in a doorway or in a field outside the wall, and one of them says, "I take you as my husband," and the other says, "I take you as my wife." And at that moment, they are married, fully, permanently, and in the eyes of the church, completely. There is no waiting period. Nothing has to be registered anywhere because there is nowhere to register it. Nobody else has to be present, and nobody else has to be told, and neither of their families has to agree, and no priest has to be within a mile of the place. The tense is not a detail, it is the entire hinge. I take you makes a marriage on the spot. I will take you makes a promise of one. A betrothal, binding in its own way but not the same thing at all, and dissolvable under certain conditions in a way that marriage was not. Same 2 people, same afternoon, same room, and the difference between being engaged and being married for life was a verb. That is not a loophole somebody found. It is the settled doctrine of the Western Church, argued out over the 12th century and hardened into law under Pope Alexander III. And the logic behind it is the interesting part, because the Church was giving away something it had every institutional reason to keep. The reasoning is theological. Marriage is a sacrament, and the ministers of that particular sacrament are the couple themselves. They confer it on each other. A priest at a wedding is a witness and a blessing. He is not the mechanism. And if the couple make the marriage, then the couple's consent is the whole of what is required, and everything else, the church, the banns, the ring, the fathers, the feast, is custom laid on top of a thing that was already complete without it. The minimum ages were correspondingly low, 12 for a girl, 14 for a boy, with formal betrothal possible a good deal earlier than that. What those numbers tell us is what the law would permit, which is not at all the same as what people ordinarily did. And here we should be honest about the size of the hole in our knowledge. For the great households where marriages were treaties, we have dates and ages and contracts. For the family living above the workshop, we have almost nothing. We do not know at what age most Parisians married, and anybody who tells you confidently is extrapolating from a different century or a different country. Which brings us to the difficulty that consent alone creates. And it is a large one. If a marriage is made by 2 people saying words to each other, and no witness is required for it to be real, then the question that arrives in court is never, are they married? It is can it be shown. And the cases that survive have a horrible sameness to them. She says the words were spoken. He says they were words of future promise, not present consent, or says nothing was said at all. There were no witnesses, because the whole point was that there did not need to be. So the court is left trying to establish, after the fact and under oath, the exact grammatical form of a private sentence spoken months or years earlier by two people who now want opposite things. Anyone who has tried to reconstruct later and in front of someone else precisely what was agreed in a conversation with nobody else in the room already knows the shape of that problem. The Church understood the difficulty perfectly well and spent centuries trying to have it both ways. Marriages made in private were valid, and they were also forbidden. The Great Council at Rome in 1215 required that intentions be published in advance and that weddings happen openly, and made secret marriage an offence, while conceding, because it could not do otherwise without unpicking its own theology, that a secret marriage was nonetheless a marriage, valid and illicit at the same time. The custom that grew up around the compromise is the reason so many medieval weddings happen at the church door rather than at the altar. The consent was given outside, in public, in front of everybody, where it could be seen and remembered, and only then did the party go in for the Mass. The present tense is still in the vows, incidentally, at every wedding any of us has ever sat through, and it is still doing exactly the same work. What almost never reaches us is a marriage that worked. That is worth stating flatly because it shapes everything we are able to say. The records that survive about marriage in this period are overwhelmingly records of dispute. Suits over whether a marriage exists, suits over property, suits brought by one party against another. Courts document breakage. A couple who married at 20 worked side by side for 30 years, buried 3 children and were buried in the same ground, generate no paperwork whatsoever, and so they are invisible to us. And there were vastly more of them than of the other kind. The Paris Church Court's own registers, as it happens, only begin to survive from the 1380s, which means that even the failures we can read about are from more than a century after this morning. We are reconstructing the ordinary from the exceptional at a distance, and it is worth saying so rather than describing a Parisian marriage as though we had watched one. What we can say with more confidence is what a marriage was for, because that is legible in the way households were built. A marriage in a craft household is a working partnership before it is anything else. The workshop on the ground floor is not the husband's business with a wife somewhere upstairs. It is the household's business, and the wife is in it. She may be doing the same work, or the selling, or the accounts, or a related trade of her own. When he dies, she can very often carry the trade on in her own name, keep the apprentices, and keep the mastership, which is not a courtesy but a recognition of what she had already been doing for 20 years. And running alongside all of that, quite independently of anything canon law had to say, was money. A dowry was not required for a marriage to be valid. It was required for a marriage to be arranged. Families negotiated, property moved, and the two systems ran in parallel without ever quite meeting. The Church insisting that a marriage was two people's private consent, and the world insisting with considerable force that it was two families' public transaction. Both were true at once, and the friction between them is where most of the misery in the surviving cases comes from. All of which assumes a household to be in. A great many women in this city had nothing of the kind. In December of 1254, the king signed an ordinance that ordered prostitutes expelled from the towns of his kingdom, their goods confiscated, and this is the clause that shows somebody had thought about enforcement. A year's rent forfeited by anyone who gave them a roof. Aim a law at the women, and you are chasing individuals through a city with 12 gates. Aim it at their landlords and you are dealing with men who own property, can be found and have a great deal to lose. It did not work. The women went out of sight rather than out of Paris, which is what happens, and within a very short time the pressure was running the other way. The king was being pressed to relent, and by 1256, the policy had already retreated from expulsion to containment, not gone, simply kept away from the churches and the cemeteries and the respectable middle of things. The bathhouse keeper's rule against running brothels upstairs belongs to the same world and tells the same story from the other end. Underneath the ordinances is an economic fact that neither of them addressed, which is that in this city, a woman's wage frequently did not cover a woman's survival. Service, laundry, spinning, carrying, these paid what they paid, and what they paid was not always enough, and the gap was closed however it could be closed. That is not a moral observation about the women. It is an arithmetical observation about the wages, and it is the reason the law kept failing. There is exactly one Parisian from this century who tells us what his own wedding was like, and he is not a witness anyone should trust. On the 2nd of January, 1261, 5 years past the morning we are standing in these same streets, a jongleur who wrote under the name Midwife got married and then wrote a poem about it. The wife in the poem is old and ugly and brings nothing with her and has no sweetness of temper to make up for any of it. He himself is broke, mostly through dice and cold, and behind on everything. It is a performance. He is selling the character of the ruined poet. The complaint is the product, and the poem exists to be recited in front of somebody who might pay him for it. Whether his wife was old, or plain, or poor, or none of those things, we have no way on earth of knowing, and it would be a poor return on her silence to repeat his description as though it were a fact about her. Anyone who has ever made their own difficulties funny in order to survive them, or in order to get somebody else to help, will recognize the maneuver precisely, which is the thing that lasts out of all of this. A system that builds a marriage out of what two people meant, rather than out of what was written down, has to keep answering an impossible question. What does intention look like from outside afterwards when the two people disagree? Every arrangement since has come back to that same difficulty with different paperwork. And what Rutebeuf actually wanted, underneath the joke, was money for bread and money for wine, both of which at this hour were being shouted in the street outside his door. By the middle of the day the noise has changed completely. At first light, a single voice could carry the length of a street because there was nothing for it to carry over. By noon there is no carrying at all. Everyone is shouting, the carts are on the move, the shutters are down and being leaned on, and the general sound of the city has settled into something continuous that nobody in it can hear anymore. And then one voice cuts through it anyway, and it cuts through because it is doing something none of the others are doing. It is counting. Good wine at 4, at 6, at 8, at 12, at 16, at 32. The man calling it has a cup in one hand and a measure in the other, and he stops at a corner, runs the ladder of prices, adds whatever he thinks the wine deserves, good wine, fine wine, wine of quality, and then names the house it is being sold at and how to find the door. If you were standing near enough when he stopped, he would pour you a mouthful, and you would drink it, and he would watch your face while you did. This is not a shopkeeper drumming up custom. It is a licensed office. The trade of crying wine was created by royal grant in 1220, and its rules, when they were eventually set down with everybody else's, are startling. A tavern keeper cannot refuse the crier's services. He owes him 4 deniers for the day, whether he wants him or not. The crier must go to the merchant's own cellar and taste the wine himself before he is allowed to cry it, so that what is being shouted in the street has at least passed one mouth that is not the seller's. And if a tavern keeper decides he would rather not take part and shuts his door against the crier, then the crier is entitled to go out into the street and cry that man's wine at the king's price, and the man is then bound to sell it at that price. The whole apparatus exists to solve a problem that is easy to forget from here. Most of the people this information is aimed at cannot read. A price written on a board is useless to them, and a sign that says anything at all is useless to them. And so the price has to be spoken, and spoken loudly, by somebody whose job it is and who can be punished for getting it wrong. The cry is the price list. Everything we now do with labels and posted tariffs and the small print on a menu, this city did with a man on a corner and a legal obligation on the seller to let him work. Underneath the wine, though, and long before it in importance, is bread. The bakers of Paris were not called bakers. They were called sifters. The name comes from the sieving of the flour. And the sieving was the part that was watched, because the sieving is where a dishonest man makes his money. Sift less or sift in something that is not flour, and the loaf still looks like a loaf. When the customs of every trade in the city were finally written out and bound together, the bakers came first in the book, not alphabetically and not by chance. First, ahead of the goldsmiths and the mercers and everybody else with money and standing, and their statute is the longest in the entire collection. 61 articles, where most trades needed a dozen or 20. That ordering is a statement about what the authorities of this city thought could destroy them, and it was not a shortage of peacock feather hats. Bread came in 3 grades, from a fine white loaf down to a coarse dark one, and the pricing works in a way that is worth pausing on, because it explains the shape of the thing. A standard loaf costs a denier. There is a double loaf at 2 deniers and a half loaf at a half penny, and that is essentially the whole range, because those are the coins that exist. In a city with no large coin, bread has to be priced at what a person can actually put into a hand. The loaf is not sized to appetite. It is sized to the money. Anyone who has watched the price of something basic move and watched the mood of everyone around them move with it understands why the sifters got 61 articles. The penalties reflect the same anxiety. A baker caught cheating faced the frame in the market, standing where every customer he had would walk past him, and beyond that, he could be put out of the trade entirely and for good. In a world where a man's craft is his only asset and the guilds of every other town are closed to strangers, a lifetime ban is not a fine. It is the end of the man. If you had gone to buy at the wrong hour, you would have found nothing at all, incidentally. A baker bakes when the oven has come up to heat and sells until it is gone, and an oven is fired once or twice if the day is good, because fuel costs what fuel costs. The wine itself came from closer than people expect and further than people expect, both at once. Vines grew almost against the wall. Monks were working something like 15 hectares of them on the high ground north of the city, and the vineyards out west supplied wine that went to the hospital on the island for the sick, on the reasonable theory that it was better for an invalid than water. Ordinary Parisians drank a great deal of local wine simply because it was local, and because everything that came further had to pay duty at the gates, which, as the students discovered on Shrove Tuesday, is why the cheap drinking happened outside them. What came further came by water. Wine from Burgundy travelled down the Yonne to Auxerre, and from there towards Paris in a way that is almost too good to be true. Rafts of enormous logs floated down out of the forests to be sold as timber, with the barrels loaded on top of them for the ride. The wine rode to market on the market. none of it kept. There were no bottles, no corks, nothing sealed. Wine sat in barrels and it was drunk young, within the year, in a long race between one harvest and the next, and by the following summer, whatever was left had turned. Figures for how much of it a Parisian got through in a day circulate very freely, and none of them survives contact with an actual source, so we will let them alone. What we do have, from 30 years before this morning, is a ranking. In 1224, a Norman poet named Henri d'Andely wrote a mock epic about a great wine judging supposedly staged for the king. Some 70 wines from all over France and well beyond it, from Cyprus and Spain and the Moselle, brought in and set before a single judge, who is an English priest. The priest tastes each one in turn and delivers a verdict, and the verdicts are the joke. Every wine is either celebrated or excommunicated. He works his way through the field. He grows steadily less coherent as he goes, and at the end he awards the highest honor of all, the title of apostle, to a sweet wine from Cyprus. It is a comic poem, and almost certainly not a report of anything that happened. But a joke has to be legible to land, and for that joke to land, an audience in Paris in the 1220s had to already know which wines were which, where they came from, and roughly what a person was supposed to think of them. Anyone who has sat through a tasting that went on rather longer than it should have will recognize precisely what is being satirized, and the satire only works because the thing being satirized was familiar. All of which was consumed overwhelmingly in taverns. And the tavern has come down to us badly. The people who wrote about taverns in this century were, almost without exception, people whose profession was disapproval. Churchmen wrote about them as sinks of dice and drunkenness and ruin. The university forbade its students to be in them, repeatedly, which tells us how effective the prohibition was. The royal administration would shortly have a great deal to say on the subject. And every one of those complaints was true. Men did lose everything at dice in these rooms, and Routebeuf was one of them, and he wrote it down. But those are the only voices we have, and they are describing a place they had already decided about. Here is what a tavern was for the rest of the city. It was the only heated, lit, public room available to a person who did not own a hall. It was where contracts were made because a bargain struck in front of witnesses in a public room with wine drunk on it was the contract. In a world where most agreements were never written down, the room full of people who saw you shake hands is the whole legal instrument. It was where men were hired for work. It was where you found somebody who knew somebody. It was where news arrived and where the news was tested, and where a man in from Rouen with something to sell would sit until he found the man who wanted it. Take the taverns out of this city and its commerce stops, and everybody who wrote disapprovingly about them knew that perfectly well. If you had pushed a tavern door at 4 in the afternoon, you would have found the light bad, the air thick, a game going in one corner, 2 men doing business at a board in another, and a great deal of argument. Over prices, over the wine, over who owed what to whom, over whatever had happened in the street that morning. And a mile away, up the hill, in a colder room with straw on the floor, another argument was going on entirely. Same city, same hour, and the men in that room had been trained for years in how to disagree properly, in a language nobody's mother spoke, over a question that had just cost one of them everything he had. There are soldiers outside the lecture room. They are the king's men, and they are there because the man who is about to lecture cannot safely walk to his own chair without them. It is December of 1256. He is a friar in his early 30s from a noble family in southern Italy, very large, and so quiet in company that his fellow students are supposed to have called him the dumb ox. Though that story reaches us through his biographers rather than through anybody who was in the room at the time, and biographers of saints are not disinterested. His name is Thomas Aquinas, and he has just been given a chair in theology at the University of Paris, and a substantial part of the university would like him gone, not for anything he has written, for what he is. To understand why a theologian needed an armed escort to give a lecture, you have to go back about 30 years, to the arrival in this city of something genuinely new. The mendicant orders, the Dominicans and the Franciscans, were barely a generation old. They were not monks in the older sense, shut away in an abbey with lands and rents. They were friars, sworn to own nothing, living on what was given to them, preaching in streets and marketplaces to ordinary people in ordinary language. They were enormously popular. They were also extremely good at theology, and they came to Paris because Paris was where theology was done. And then they took chairs. The masters of the university were, overwhelmingly, secular clergy, men in orders but not in an order, whose careers ran through the schools and then, if things went well, into a comfortable church appointment somewhere. Teaching in Paris was their profession and their ladder. Every chair a friar held was a chair one of them did not, and the friars did not need the salary because the order fed them, which meant they could undercut everybody. Then came the grievance that never healed, when the whole university walked out over the killings and stayed out for more than 2 years. The friars kept teaching. Whether that was a betrayal depends entirely on who you ask. The friars did not consider themselves members of the master's corporation in the way the seculars did, and were not obviously bound by its decisions. What is beyond dispute is that they were the only people teaching theology in Paris during the dispersion, that they came out of it with chairs, and that nobody on the other side ever forgot it. There was a structural problem underneath all of that, and it was the one that could not be negotiated away. A secular master who broke the university's rules could be disciplined by the university. A friar could not. He answered to his prior, and his prior answered to his order, and his order answered to the Pope. The corporation had no hold on him whatsoever. It came to a head in 1253. There was another dispute, another suspension of lectures, and again the friars would not join it. This time the masters retaliated properly. They voted the friars out of the corporation altogether and refused to recognize their degrees. The friars appealed to Rome. Rome, which had spent 30 years building these orders into the sharpest instrument it possessed, decided in their favor, and kept deciding in their favor, and the university discovered that it had picked a fight it could not win. Which is the point at which the argument stopped being about chairs. The man who took it there was a secular master of theology named William of Saint-Amour, and in 1256 he published a book called On the Dangers of the Last Times. It is not a complaint about appointments. It is an argument built out of Scripture that the friars are the false apostles whose coming was foretold as a sign that the world was ending. That men who beg while able-bodied, who hear confessions in parishes not their own, who preach without being sent, are precisely what the prophecies described, and that their success is not a triumph of the Church, but a symptom of its final corruption. Anyone who has watched a dispute about money and positions acquire a moral vocabulary knows how fast that escalation happens, and why. The friars' claim on those chairs was a religious claim, that a life of poverty and preaching had a special authority. So the attack had to be religious too, or it was only a complaint about employment. It did not go well for him. In June of 1256, the Pope suspended him from every office he held. In October, the book was condemned and ordered to be burned. He put in a defense early the following year. The defense was rejected, and he was exiled from France and did not teach again. The reason we can hand you the months is that the university kept its papers. charters, papal letters, statutes, judgments, the whole administrative sediment of a corporation that spent most of its existence in litigation, collected in the 19th century, arranged by date, and printed. It is possible to sit with those volumes and follow a quarrel from 800 years ago as it moves, month by month, from a procedural dispute to a book on the fire. Thomas Aquinas wrote the reply to that book in the same year, defending the orders against exactly the charges William had brought. So when he walked to his chair in December, he was a friar, holding a position the secular masters said he had no right to hold, about to lecture to students whose own teachers had been telling them for months that his order was a sign of the end of the world. The soldiers were not a formality, and the quarrel had long since left the hill. Rutebeuf, who was not a master, had no chair to lose and was writing to be paid, took the secular's side and produced a string of poems attacking the friars, which he performed in the streets of this city for whoever would listen. Topical satire only works on material the audience already has. You do not write jokes about an academic dispute unless the people in the tavern have opinions about it, and in Paris in these years, they did. Against all of which, in 1257, something quiet happened. The king's confessor was a man named Robert de Sorbonne, and he had noticed a plain problem. A degree in theology could take as long as 20 years to complete. 20 years of not earning, of paying rent and buying food and hiring books in a city that was expensive then and has never stopped being expensive. That length of study was possible for a man with family money, or for a man holding a church, living somewhere that paid him while he was elsewhere. For everybody else, it was simply out of reach, no matter how good they were. So he acquired a property with the king's help and put poor students of theology into it, about 20 of them at the start, with somewhere to sleep and something to eat, and no rent to find. You know the name. It is probably the most famous name in the history of European education, and it began as one man's practical idea about board and lodging for young men who could not otherwise afford to finish. What he built onto it afterwards tells you where the real barrier was. By the end of the century, the house had a library of over 1,000 volumes, the largest anywhere in the university. Because that was the other reason 20 years was necessary: books. Every book in this city is written out by hand. A single copy of a substantial text is months of a trained scribe's life, and it costs accordingly, the price of a horse or of several. A student cannot own the works he is studying. The master reads aloud from his copy and everyone else remembers, which is why medieval memories were what they were and why the degrees took what they took. What the university did about it is one of the cleverest pieces of organization in the whole century. It approved an official copy of a text, the exemplar, and then had that copy taken apart into unbound gatherings of about 4 leaves each. The gatherings were numbered. Stationers on the hill rented them out singly, at rates the university fixed, so that instead of one scribe working through one book for 6 months, 10 scribes could be working on 10 different sections of the same book at the same time, and the parts could be assembled at the end. The rental prices were capped, the exemplar was checked for accuracy, and anybody, students, professional copyists, laymen, women, could take a piece and work. One authorized master copy, broken into portions, licensed out at a controlled price so that many people could work from it at once. Every generation since has rediscovered some version of that arrangement and thought it was new. The lists of the fixed prices that survive from Paris are from 1275, and later, so we are reading the tariff of a slightly older city than the one we are standing in. The system itself is here already, running up and down this hill on this afternoon, and you can still see it working. Books copied this way carry small numbers in the margins, a scribe marking where one rented piece ended and the next began. And 8 centuries later, those little marks are how a librarian can tell that the volume in front of her was made in Paris, in pieces, by somebody who was renting the original 4 leaves at a time. All of which required skins, prepared, scraped, stretched, cut and sold by a trade that had set itself up along the road running down the hill, close to its customers. The skins came from animals, and the animals came from outside, and so did the grain and the wine and the stone and the wood and the fish and every other thing that this city consumed without producing. All of it arrived the same way, and there is one place to stand if you want to watch it happen. The landing place on the north bank is not a wharf. It is a strand. A shelving bank of sand and gravel running down into the water, wide enough to work on, and the name it goes by is simply a description of the ground. Boats come up onto it. There is no lifting gear worth the name and no deep berth. A laden river barge is run at the shore until it grounds, and then men go into the water to get at it. That is the whole technology. Everything this city consumes arrives across 40 feet of wet gravel on somebody's back. If you had come down there in the afternoon, you would have found it loud, crowded, and organized in a way that takes a while to see. Sacks of grain going up the slope in a chain, barrels rolled and then wedged, hay, charcoal, salt, fish in baskets that leak. Dressed stone lying where it was set down because nobody moves dressed stone twice if they can avoid it, and cut timber floating in rafts alongside, waiting its turn. The porters work all day. They carry on the back and the shoulders, on gravel, up an incline, and they do it from first light, and the trade wore men out early and everyone involved knew it. And none of them owned any part of what they were carrying, or the right to carry it. The river belonged to a company. In 1170, a royal charter granted a body of Paris merchants the right of navigation on the Seine, from the bridge at Mantes, a good way downstream, all the way to the bridges of Paris. 30 years before that, they had bought the principal landing place itself from the crown. What those 2 documents amount to, taken together, is a monopoly on the approach to the capital of France, by water, in a kingdom where water is how heavy things move. No outsider brought goods into Paris by river without coming to terms with them. They set the conditions, they took their share, and they enforced it. We should ask whether the vocabulary is doing us a favor here. These men are usually described as a guild or a merchant association, and both of those words carry a comfortable smell of craftsmen and oaths and patron saints. What is actually being described is a chartered cartel holding the food supply of a great city by legal right. Whether that is the same kind of institution as the sworn shoemakers of a back lane is a question worth putting, and the medieval terminology tends to blur it. You have seen their badge, incidentally, whether or not you knew what you were looking at. A ship, on water, under sail. It is on the arms of Paris to this day. On the front of the city hall, on lampposts, on official paper, on the ironwork. And it did not begin as a poetic image of a city on a river. It began as the emblem of the men who controlled the traffic on it. The oldest surviving symbol of Paris is a shipping company's mark. It went further than symbolism. Money and control of supply are the 2 things that turn merchants into government, and this association had both. Its leading members had been drifting into the administration of the city for generations, and it was under this king that the arrangement hardened into something recognizable. A merchant's provost and a body of civic officers alongside the royal one, running the ordinary business of Paris. The men who owned the river ended up owning the town hall, which they had also, in a manner of speaking, bought. What came off the strand went, a great deal of it, to 2 large buildings a short walk inland. They had been put up around 1183 on ground at the Champeau that had been marsh and had to be drained first, and they were exactly what a market needs and almost nowhere had: a roof and a wall around the whole enclosure with doors that were locked at night. That is the part that matters. An open market means every trader packs up and carts his stock home every evening and brings it back every morning. A market you can shut means the goods stay, which means you can trade in volume, which means everything changes. And they were built for cloth, not for food. The great markets of Paris, whose name eventually became a byword for the belly of the city, for fish and cabbages and blood and onions at 4 a.m, began as sheds for textiles, because textiles were the valuable, portable, taxable trade that a king wanted, concentrated where he could see it. The food arrived later, spread, took over, and thoroughly buried the original purpose. Almost nobody now would guess it. Behind all of it stands the countryside, which this city consumed and did not think about. Paris ate a region. Grain came in from the flat wheat country to the west and south, carted by villagers who set out before dawn to reach a gate by mid-morning, and floated in from further off. Wood came down from the forests, and stone and hay for the animals that pulled the carts that brought the hay. Every single day, the surplus of several hundred villages walked or floated into these streets and was gone by evening. The villages did not get rich on it. A great deal of what they sent was not sold at all in any sense they benefited from. It moved because they owed it, as rent and as dues, to landlords and religious houses whose actual residence was in the city they were feeding. The grain came in, the money mostly stayed in, and the arrangement was not accidental. If you had stood at one of the gates from first light, you would have watched the whole system arrive. Carts, one behind another, each stopping to be assessed, because the gates were not only defences, they were where the city took its cut of everything entering it, which is how a wall pays for itself, and which is why students walked out to drink. And when the assessment had to be paid, there was a second complication that nobody in this kingdom found funny. France had 2 pounds. There was the pound of Paris and the pound of Tours, and they were not the same pound. They stood at 4 to 5. So a Tours pound was worth 16 Paris shillings rather than 20, and both were in use, and both were used to write contracts, and a merchant had to know which one a price was quoted in before he could tell whether he was being robbed. That is on top of the fact, which we have already run into on the bridge, that neither pound existed as a coin at all. For sums of any size, the physical currency was hopeless, and the people who solved it were foreigners. By the end of this century, something like 180 Italian merchant banking companies had branch offices in Paris. Not 180 Italian merchants, 180 firms, with partners and correspondents and offices in other cities. What they sold, alongside spices and silk and credit, was the ability to make money travel without moving it. A sum paid in here against a document, and the same sum handed over there in a different currency weeks later to a man holding the other half of the paper. No carts, no armed escort, no 24,000 pennies in a barrel. Anyone who has moved money between 2 countries and been quietly astonished that it works at all is doing business with the direct descendants of that arrangement, and it was invented by people solving exactly this problem in exactly these years, which leaves the thing that is easiest to miss about all of it. Not one person walking down the middle of this city on this afternoon, not the students, not the masters with soldiers at the door, not the men arguing prices in the tavern, is thinking about the Strand. The bread is simply there. The wine is simply there. The stone for the cathedral arrives, and the parchment arrives, and the fish arrives, and none of it is anybody's subject. A city is a machine for making its own supply invisible, and it has been doing that since there were cities. and it is doing it here about as thoroughly as it has ever been done. The river runs the other way too, of course. Everything that comes in can go out, and downstream is the sea. 8 years before this afternoon, in the late summer of 1248, the man who owned this city went down to the water and left it, with an army, and did not come back for a very long time. What happened to him happened about 2,000 miles from this gravel bank, on a morning in April, in a place none of these people would ever see. By the 7th of April, 1250, the thing coming back down the Nile from Mansoura was not really an army anymore. It had been one when it went up. What was coming back had been taken apart by dysentery, which had run through the camps in the delta all winter and had killed more men than any Egyptian had, and which does not permit dignity of any kind to the people it has. The retreat was a column of the sick, moving slowly along a river with the enemy on both banks. Men were dying in the boats and beside the road. The rearguard was cut off. And among the worst afflicted was the King of France, who was so ill by then that he could barely sit a horse, and whose condition his friend Jean de Joinville, who was with him, and who would spend the last years of his own long life writing all of this down, described afterwards with a frankness that made later admirers uncomfortable. They took him on the 7th, not in a battle, in the collapse. He was held for about a month and released on the 6th of May, and the terms of the release were these: the surrender of the port the army had captured, and a ransom of £400,000 of tours for the rest of the men. It is worth converting that, because we have been standing on a bridge watching money change hands in this city, and we know what money physically is here. £400,000 in a kingdom whose only real coin is a small silver penny is 96 million pennies. Nobody counted them. They were weighed. And then, having been ransomed, he did not come home. This is the part that gets passed over quickly and should not be. He was free in May of 1250, and he did not sail for France until the spring of 1254. 4 more years. He went to what was left of the Crusader kingdom on the coast and stayed there, rebuilding the walls of the ports, negotiating with everyone who would negotiate, and spending very large sums buying back prisoners who had been left behind, which by every account was the thing he cared about most. Why he stayed is the question, and the honest answer is that we are guessing. What the sources report is that he had come to believe the whole disaster was a judgment on him, that God had permitted the defeat because of his sins, and that abandoning the survivors on top of that would have compounded it. That is a coherent account, and it may well be the true one. If you have ever stayed too long in a situation because leaving would have meant conceding that it had failed, you have some purchase on it. But we should be careful, because a man's stated reasons and a man's reasons are not always the same document, and this particular man has come down to us almost entirely through people who were trying to make him a saint. France, in the meantime, had no king in it, and was being run by his mother. Blanche of Castile had done this before. She had held the kingdom together through her son's minority. When he came to the throne at 12 and a half, the great lords of France decided that a boy and a foreign widow were an opportunity. She was the regent who, 20 years earlier, had sent soldiers against the students. Nobody in her lifetime accused her of softness, and nobody accused her of incompetence either. She took the regency again in 1248, in her 60s, and by all the evidence, she governed well. She died on the 27th of November, 1252, with her son on the other side of the Mediterranean. The news had to travel to him. A ship, a season, a coast, a road. Weeks at the very best, and more likely months, and there is no way now to say precisely when he learned it. What we can say is that a man was told, somewhere on the coast of Palestine, that his mother had been dead for some unknown length of time, and that whatever there had been to settle between them had finished being settleable before he heard about it. Anyone who has received that kind of news late and had to do the arithmetic backwards about where they were and what they were doing on the day will know the particular useless quality of it. He still did not come home for nearly 2 more years. When he finally did, landing in the south in the summer of 1254 and reaching Paris in September, he had been gone 6 years. And the man who came back was not the man who had left. The change is well attested, and it was visible. He dressed plainly, in dark cloth without ornament, to the point where visitors from abroad occasionally failed to identify him. He ate simply. He gave enormous sums away, personally and constantly. He washed the feet of the poor and served lepers with his own hands, which was not a symbolic gesture performed once for a chronicler, but a repeated part of his week. If you had seen him crossing the island in 1255, you would very likely not have picked him out of the group he was walking with. And within 3 months of getting back, he signed the largest piece of legislation of his reign. Some of it he had already started. Before he ever left, in 1247, he had done something genuinely unusual. He sent investigators out across the kingdom with instructions to hear complaints against his own officials. Anybody with a grievance against a royal officer could come and state it. And to put right what could be put right. A king auditing his own government at his own expense in order to depart with a clean conscience. He restarted and widened it when he came back. The Ordinance of December 1254 is the settled form of all that thinking, and it splits cleanly in 2. The administrative half is the part that worked. Royal officers were forbidden to take gifts from the people they governed, forbidden to gamble, forbidden to frequent taverns, forbidden to visit brothels. The point being that an officer with debts and appetites in the district he administers is an officer who can be bought. Trial by ordeal was abolished. The royal coinage was made current throughout the kingdom over the money of the great lords, and judicial business was pushed towards men trained to do it, rather than towards whoever happened to hold the office, which is the beginning of a professional court system in France, and the reason this reign is remembered the way it is. Then there is the other half, and the other half is where this chapter has been going since the first page of this documentary. Taverns were to be reserved for travellers and forbidden to the people who actually lived in the town. Read that against everything we have already stood inside. The tavern is the heated public room. It is where contracts are witnessed and men are hired and news is tested, and a stranger with goods to sell finds the man who wants them. A law closing it to residents is not a temperance measure. It is an instruction to a commercial city to stop doing business in the only place it has to do business. Dice were banned, along with chess and draughts and backgammon. Blasphemy carried the penalty we have already seen written on men's faces. And the women were to be put out of the towns, with their landlords made to forfeit a year's rent. A provision whose collapse and whose quiet reversal within about 18 months we have already watched happen. Nobody in Paris stopped playing dice. Rutebeuf went on losing at it for another 20 years and made a small living writing about how much it had cost him. The taverns went on being taverns. The ordinance was proclaimed and copied and enforced in patches, and the city it was aimed at absorbed it roughly the way cities always absorb this kind of thing. By complying where somebody was watching and carrying on where nobody was. It is a very old pattern, and it is not usually hypocrisy on either side. A man comes back from something that has changed him, into a world that has not been changed, and legislates for the world as he now is rather than as it is. He is not wrong about what the dice do to people. He has simply stopped wanting any of it himself and has lost the ability to remember wanting it. That happens in kingdoms and it happens in households, and the people on the receiving end recognize it immediately in both. What we cannot do is say what any of it felt like to him. That is the honest position, and it is worth ending on. We know what he signed and what he wore and where he went on foot and what he gave away, because those things were witnessed and recorded. We do not have a letter in which he describes being a prisoner. We do not have anything at all in which he says what it was to be told, months late on a foreign coast, that his mother was dead. We do not know whether coming home to a kingdom that had managed perfectly well without him was a relief or an injury. Joinville, who loved him and who was writing half a century afterwards with the explicit purpose of getting him canonized, gives us a man of enormous seriousness and considerable warmth. And Joinville is the best witness we have, and he is not a neutral one, and there is no second witness standing behind him to check against. So we are left with the documents, and the documents are about other people. While the clerks were copying the ordinance out for the provinces, on the island a few hundred yards away, a man was doing something much smaller and much more durable. He was cutting his own name into the wall of a building, along with the month and the year, and it is still legible. On the outside of the south transept of the cathedral, cut into the stone at a height where anybody can read it, there is a date and a man's name. It gives the year as 1257 and the month as February. The exact modern equivalent is very slightly uncertain because the year did not begin in January here, and the conventions vary. And it records that on that date the work was begun, and it names the master mason under whom it was begun. Jean de Chelles. Whether he cut the letters himself or set one of his carvers to it is not something the stone says, and it hardly matters. He put his name on the building while he was alive and while the work was going on, and it is still legible, and people walk under it every day of the year without looking up. That is worth stopping on because of who does not have a name here. There is no shortage of monuments in Paris to men who commissioned things. What there is almost none of is the other kind. A working man on wages, whose name is on the front of the thing he made, in his own century, by his own arrangement. Out of everybody in this documentary, out of the whole enormous population we have been walking through, he is very nearly the only one who arranged to be remembered and got away with it. Of the man himself we know essentially nothing. No will, no biography, no face, no account of his household. He came from a place east of the city that gave him his name. He built the north front of the transept, with its great rows, across the 1240s and into 1258. In the February of the inscription, he began the south front to match it. And later that same year, he died, and somebody else finished it. His idea, if a building can be said to carry one, was that the wall could go. Everything in that transept front is about removing stone, reducing masonry to the minimum framework that will hold glass upright against the wind and the weight of a roof, and then filling the space that used to be wall with light. A rose window of that size is not decoration laid onto a building. It is a structural problem solved so completely that it stops looking like a problem, and it needs iron armature and tracery, cut to tolerances that leave no room for a bad day, and glass made and painted somewhere else, and brought in and fitted, piece by piece, into an opening. It must match exactly. There were something like 200 stonemasons in this city. Almost all of them are anonymous. What we have of them is their work and their marks. Small personal signs cut into the blocks they dressed, so the man paying the wages could tell whose stone was whose, and those marks are still on the stones. in the dark, where nobody was ever meant to see them. Which brings us to the thing everybody gets wrong about this cathedral, and about all of them. We see them finished. Every photograph, every memory, every idea any of us has of a great medieval church is of a completed building standing still. Not one single person who lived in Paris in the 13th century ever saw that. They saw a construction site continuously for their entire lives, and their parents' lives, and their children's lives, and the last of the work would not be done for another 60 years after this morning. The finished building is a modern experience. The medieval experience was scaffolding. 200 yards west, though, inside the palace walls, stood something that had been finished, quickly and at a cost that is genuinely hard to absorb. The story starts in Constantinople, with a bankrupt emperor. Baldwin, who held the Latin throne there and held very little else, had pawned the crown of thorns to Venetian bankers and could not redeem it. Word reached Paris. The King of France paid the debt, took the relic, and over the following years bought most of the rest of the Passion relics that came onto the market with it. The figure generally given for the crown alone is £135,000 of tours, something in the region of half the annual revenue of the royal domain. The chapel raised to hold it, built and glazed and finished in about 7 years, came to roughly 40,000. The box cost less than a third of what was in it. It is worth setting that against the other great sum in this reign. 10 years after the purchase, the freedom of his own surviving army cost 400,000. So the crown of thorns came to something like a third of the ransom of a defeated crusade. Which is one way of getting a grip on a number that otherwise means nothing at all. The relics arrived in the summer of 1239 and came up towards Paris from the south, resting overnight in the cathedral at Sens. And on the 19th of August, the king went out to meet them. He took off his royal dress. He put on a plain tunic, and he went barefoot, and he carried the thing himself, shouldered with another man taking the other end of the frame, for a considerable distance in August on a road in front of everybody. The man who wrote that down was not a spectator. Gauthier Cornu was Archbishop of Sens. He was one of the churchmen inside the ceremony, and he produced an account of the whole transfer afterwards. He is describing something he helped to carry. And the king was 25. That matters more than it looks. The barefoot man on the Sens road is not the figure we met coming home from Egypt. Not the plain-dressed penitent who had been broken by 6 years, and a defeat and a death he heard about. Too late. That comes 15 years later. This is a young king, near the start of his reign, doing something enormously public and enormously deliberate, and doing it extremely well, because it was also politics, and pretending otherwise would be a poor kind of history. A collection of Passion relics on that scale, housed in a chapel inside the royal palace, made Paris something it had not been, a destination, a second Jerusalem in the imagination of Latin Christendom, with the French crown personally in possession of the most charged objects in the religious world. Every ruler in Europe understood what had just happened. The barefoot walk was sincere. There is no good reason to doubt the man's faith, which everyone who knew him attests, and which cost him a great deal more than a walk. And it was simultaneously one of the most effective pieces of political theatre of the century. Devotion and statecraft arriving in the same gesture at the same hour, carried on the same shoulders. It is not our business to rank them, and it would be dishonest to describe only the bare feet. The chapel still stands, and the glass in it is still, overwhelmingly, the original 13th century glass. The crown itself survived the revolution, which melted the reliquary down, and it survived the fire in the cathedral in 2019, carried out by hand. For everybody who was not a king, The religious year was a matter of when you did not have to work. Sunday first, and the feast of your own parish's saint, which was a local holiday and was celebrated locally. Then the great blocks, 12 days at Christmas, which was and remained the longest stretch of rest in the year. A week around Easter, a week at Whitsun, 7 weeks after. Shrove Tuesday, which we have already seen get out of hand. And scattered through the rest of it, saints' days that stopped work in some trades and not in others, according to rules that varied by craft and by parish, and that everybody knew and nobody wrote down. Around the 1st of January came the strangest of them. The Feast of Fools was kept inside the churches by the junior clergy, and it worked by inversion. A boy or a minor cleric elected as mock bishop, the liturgy parodied, the order of precedence turned upside down for a day, the people at the bottom of the building running it. Senior churchmen complained about it for centuries, and it took centuries to suppress, which is generally the sign of something a community actually wants. And in June, north of the city at the Great Abbey, the Lendit Fair opened on the second Wednesday of the month and ran to the 23rd, the eve of the feast of St. John. A religious festival that had become a trade fair, or possibly the other way round. There is a very popular claim that people in this period had far more days off than we do. We should be careful with it. The figures usually quoted come from centuries later, and from a different administrative world, and for Paris in the 1250s, we simply do not have a reliable count of work-free days. That there were many is clear. How many is not, and the confident number in circulation is not one we can stand behind. Back on the Sens Road, though, in the August heat, there is a question the accounts do not answer. The whole city came out for that procession. We know roughly who was in it: the king, the archbishop, the great churchman, the court. What none of the sources troubled to record is who was standing at the edge of the road watching it go past. And a substantial part of the crowd that day had nothing at all, and some of the people in it would not have been permitted to walk in that procession under any circumstances whatsoever. There is a winter in Routebeuf's poems that keeps coming back. No fuel, no bread in the house, the creditors circling, the dice having taken whatever there was to take. He writes about the cold as somebody writes who is actually in it, not the season, but the specific problem of a room with nothing to burn in it. And the poem everybody remembers him for is the one asking what became of the friends he had held so close, and answering that the wind carried them off. We have already noted that he was selling a character, and that the ruined poet was his stock in trade, and that we cannot take a word of it as a report. But set that aside for a moment and look at what he had that the people this chapter is about did not. He had a craft. He had an audience and patrons, including at least one of the king's own brothers, whom he could approach. He could read and write in 2 languages. And when things went badly, he could turn the going badly into a product and sell it. He is not the bottom. He is the lowest point in this city where the light still reaches. There is a difference between having no money and having nothing, and anybody who has spent time in the first condition should be careful about assuming it taught them much about the second. Below him, and not far below him, was something on the order of half of Paris. That is the estimate that comes out of the modern work, and it is worth saying slowly. Not a fringe, not an underclass at the edges of a prosperous town. Something close to half the population living at or under the line where a bad month means hunger and a bad year means the street. Servants living in other people's houses. Laundresses, water carriers. Women spinning at piece rates in rented rooms. Men who went out each morning to find a day's work carrying, digging, unloading, and who found it or did not. Beggars who were a recognized presence rather than an aberration. And running through all of it, the newly arrived, because this city grew by people walking into it. The population we have been counting so badly was not a Paris-born population. It was fed continuously from the villages and the small towns, by young people coming in because there was nothing where they started. And the poor of Paris were very largely the recently arrived poor of somewhere else. Whatever a village does for its own, and villages did a great deal informally and without records, none of it travels with you. Against that stood charity. And charity here was enormous, constant, and structurally hopeless. It was a religious obligation, and it was taken seriously by people at every level. Bread was begged in the streets on behalf of the friars, on behalf of the hospitals, on behalf of the colleges housing students who could not feed themselves. Those cries running through the morning alongside everything else being sold. Endowments were left. Bequests were made. Bishops fed the poor at their doors, and so did great households, and so did parishes. Nobody in the 13th century was indifferent to poverty as a spiritual matter. What none of it was policy. It kept individual people alive on individual days, which is not nothing, and is close to everything if you are the person. It did not touch the arithmetic that generated the poverty in the first place, and it was not designed to, and the people administering it would not have understood the question. Every arrangement since that has depended on the generosity of the comfortable has had the same shape. It works, one person at a time, and it never runs out of people. There was also, in this city, a community that the law had a quite separate set of intentions towards. The Jews of Paris had been here for generations. A quarter on the island, families, trades, physicians, merchants, and a school. That last is worth pausing on, because we have just spent a long time on a hill covered in schools. Paris in this century had two kinds of academy in it. One of them is the ancestor of every university in the world, and is remembered by name in every account of the period. The other one was a Talmudic academy, and its head was a scholar named Yechiel of Paris, and almost nobody has heard of it. The legal position had been tightening for decades. In 1230, an ordinance forbade Jews to lend at interest, which was the occupation that Christian prohibitions on usury and the closure of guild after guild and trade after trade had steadily pushed them into. The Church had required distinguishing dress since the Great Council of 1215. The specific French decree imposing the round cloth badge on penalty of a fine comes later, in 1269, after the years we are standing in. But the principle was already there, and enforcement came and went. Then, in June of 1240, a disputation was convened in Paris. It came about because a convert from Judaism, who had become a friar, took 35 charges against the Talmud to the Pope, that it blasphemed, that it insulted Christianity, that it was not the scripture the Church had believed itself to be tolerating, but a later human compilation. 4 rabbis were summoned to answer. Yechiel of Paris led the defense, and by every account, including the Latin ones, he defended it well. It did not matter. The verdict went against the book, and about 2 years afterwards, the copies that had been seized across the kingdom were brought to the north bank of the river and burned. 24 cartloads is the figure that comes down to us. The exact year is not certain. 1242 is the date most often given, and 1244 appears in reputable places, and the sources genuinely do not agree, and we would rather leave that open than tidy it. What is not in doubt is the place. They were burned on the strand, at the landing, on the gravel where the grain came off the boats. The ground the merchants of the river had bought a century earlier so the city could be fed. The pressure did not stop there. In December of 1254, in the same great ordinance that closed the taverns and banned the dice, Jews were threatened with expulsion if they kept copies of the condemned books, forbidden once again to lend at interest, and directed to earn their living by manual labor or lawful trade. The trades in question being, in most cases, closed to them. The confiscations from Jewish lenders had run heaviest in the years immediately before the Crusades sailed, and had helped to pay for it. And there is the sentence from Joinville, which we have already met and which belongs here. His king held that a layman who hears the Christian faith insulted should not argue. He should answer with a sword, driven into the belly as far as it will go. That is not an accusation from an enemy. It is reported admiringly by the man who loved him best, in a book written to persuade the church that he had been a saint, and included because Joinville thought it showed him well. It is one of the very few places where we hear something close to the man's own voice. And this is what it says. So we are holding two things at once, and we are not going to resolve them because they were not resolved. The king who founded a house so that poor students could finish their degrees, who sent investigators across his kingdom to hear complaints against his own officers, who walked barefoot through the summer dust, carrying a relic on his shoulder, is the same king. Both are documented. Neither cancels the other. Anybody who offers a version of this reign in which one of them is the real man and the other is a footnote is selling something. Which leaves the question of whether the people at the bottom of this city can be heard at all, and the answer is stranger than it ought to be. In 1282, 12 years after the king's death, the process of making him a saint required proof of miracles, and proof of miracles required witnesses. So commissioners set up at the abbey north of the city and took depositions. And to establish that a cure had happened, they needed to establish the person it had happened to. Not the name only, the whole circumstance. What was wrong with them and for how long and who could confirm it, where they lived and with whom, what they did for money, who fed them when they could not work, where they slept. The result is a body of testimony in which poor Parisians describe their own daily lives at length, under oath, in detail, because a legal process happened to need the detail. Servants, apprentices, day labourers, beggars, the disabled, women who had come in from the country and stayed. It is the closest thing to a direct account of ordinary poverty anywhere in 13th century Europe, and it survives entirely by accident of procedure. The historian who went looking for the poor of medieval Paris and found them in a file about miracles is Sharon Farmer, and her work is the reason we can say what we have been saying. The honest caveat is a large one. These are not their voices. They are their words, taken down by a clerk, translated into Latin, in answer to questions framed for a purpose that had nothing to do with them. The commissioners plainly preferred witnesses who were male and respectable, and were visibly less inclined to credit the testimony of poor women. We are reading these people through a filter constructed by men who did not think much of them. Anyone who has ever had to lay out their circumstances in front of an official in order to receive something knows the particular indignity of being required to be specific. That is the shape of this record. It is what we have. It is more than almost any other city in Europe can offer, and every line of it was extracted. Most of them, in the end, were there for the same reason. They had come to a tomb because their bodies had gone wrong, and nothing had helped. And in this city, if you were poor and something had gone wrong with your body, there was really only one door. The hospital on the island had about 300 beds in it, and on an ordinary day it was sheltering 400 or 500 people. That gap is not a failure of the record, it is the arrangement. Beds were shared, 2 to a bed as a matter of course, 3 when the house was full, and the people sharing were not chosen for compatibility of complaint. Somebody with a broken leg lay next to somebody with a fever, and both of them lay next to somebody who was dying, and the ones who were dying were the reason the beds turned over. It stood on the island in the shadow of the cathedral works, close enough that the noise of the masons would have come through the windows all day, and its beds arrived the way we have already seen them arrive, bequeathed one at a time by men obliged to leave one behind them. The name it went by was the Hôtel Dieu, the House of God, and the name is the most useful thing about it. Because this was not a hospital in the sense we mean, and almost every modern misunderstanding of it starts there. It was a house of hospitality, and hospitality was the point. It took in the sick, and it also took in the destitute who were not sick, and pregnant women with nowhere to go, and the old, and travelers who had arrived with nothing, and the dying. Admission did not require a diagnosis. It required need. Religious ran it. Women in the main, under vows, living in the house, with the daily round of offices sung through it from before dawn until after dark. The primary duty was the care of the soul, and that phrase is not a polite way of saying nobody treated anybody. It means what it says, an institution whose declared purpose was that no one in Paris should die without shelter, without company, and without the sacraments. By its own measure, a person who came in filthy and frightened and died 3 days later, washed in a bed, having been confessed, was not a failure. That was the service. If you had come in off the street on a winter night, what would have struck you first is that it is warm and it is not quiet. Several hundred people in a long hall. The singing of the offices at intervals through the night. And a smell that no amount of the strewing herbs and the vinegar and the constant laundering could get on top of, because there was no getting on top of it. None of which means that nobody tried to cure anyone. Medicine in this city was an organized, licensed, and quite sharply stratified profession, and the flat modern picture of the whole business as leeches and prayer does it a disservice that is worth correcting properly. At the top were the physicians trained in the university, which meant years of Latin and years of texts. The texts were Galen and Hippocrates, and above all the great systematizers of the Islamic world, whose work had come into Latin through Spain and southern Italy in the previous century. The Persian physician the West called Avicenna most of all, whose enormous medical encyclopedia was the standard teaching book of Europe for the next 400 years. What they had was a theory of the body built on 4 fluids, and on the idea that health is balance between them, and illness is imbalance. The physician's job was to work out which way the balance had gone and correct it, by diet, by regimen, by drawing something off. Hence the flask. The single most recognizable object in medieval medicine is a clear glass vessel, wasted, held up to the light. Urine was the chief diagnostic evidence, and it was read seriously and systematically. Color against a chart, and the chart had 20 gradations. The presence of a cloud and where in the flask it sat, the smell, and, when the case demanded, the taste. If you had gone to a physician, he would have taken the flask to the window, turned it, held it against the light for some time, and told you what he saw, and he would have meant it. The theory was coherent. It explained things people could observe, that fevers have stages, that some illnesses run in patterns, that diet changes how a person feels, and it gave a trained man a rational procedure to follow rather than a shrug. It was also wrong, more or less, from top to bottom, and the reason nobody found that out for another 500 years is that they had no way to. There was no experiment available that could have distinguished it from a better theory, because there was no better theory to distinguish it from. The other half of the profession did not deal in theory at all. Physicians did not cut. Cutting was manual labor, and manual labor was beneath a university man, and the work therefore belonged to the surgeons and, below them, to the barbers who did the same jobs at the same benches for less money. What that half of the trade handled was everything physical. Bleeding, which was prescribed constantly and had to be done by somebody. Teeth, wounds and burns, setting fractures, lancing and draining abscesses. And, at the skilled end, operations on the eye that required a very steady hand and a patient who could be held still. And here is the part that gets left out of the story. That half of medicine was genuinely competent, and it was competent for a reason that has nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with feedback. A set bone either knits straight or it does not, and the man who set it finds out. A wound either closes or it goes bad, and he finds that out too within days in front of the patient's family. Anyone who has learned a practical skill knows that you only improve at the things that tell you when you are wrong. Surgery told them. The flask never did. The surgeons of Paris got their own formal college in 1271, which is 14 years after the morning we have been walking through. So, on this afternoon, they are a trade, not yet an institution. And underneath both of them was an entirely open market. We have a piece of it because Routeboeuf wrote a monologue in the voice of a man selling remedies in the street. The seller has been everywhere. The east, the far south, places the audience has only heard named. His herbs come from impossible distances. He lists what they cure, and the list is everything. He has a stone that does something remarkable, and he will demonstrate. He must move on shortly, so the moment is now. It is a comic piece performed for money, and it only works if the audience has stood in front of that man in an actual street and recognized every move. Which means he was there on the corners of this city in these years, doing exactly that. Some of what he sold did something, incidentally. A number of the plants in the medieval pharmacopoeia have real pharmacological activity, and the people using them had centuries of accumulated observation about which ones. The problem was never that all of it was useless. The problem was that nobody could tell the difference. For one condition, there was no pretense of treatment at all. Leprosy carried a status rather than a diagnosis. A person judged to have it was separated. Out of the household, out of the parish, out of the walls, into houses maintained for that purpose on the roads outside the city, supported by charity and by their own begging. It was a religious condition as much as a medical one, understood as a trial and sometimes as a mark of election, which made the treatment of lepers a recognized form of piety, and is why the King of France washed their feet with his own hands. Around 1260, that same king founded something for another group nobody else was making arrangements for. It was a house for 300 blind poor of Paris, and its name is the number, 1520s. 300 counted in a system that reckoned in scores. It was not a medical establishment and made no attempt to be one. Nobody there was going to restore anybody's sight. It was somewhere to live. Residents kept households, married, raised children, worked at what they could, went out into the city with sighted companions, and formed a community that lasted for centuries. There is a lovely story about how it began, that the 300 were crusaders, blinded in Egypt, brought home and provided for. It is a very good story, and the hospital's own historian regards it as a legend. The institution, in the meantime, is still going in Paris, and it still deals in eyes. What all of this adds up to is not incompetence and not superstition. It is a large, sincere, well-funded, intelligently organized effort by a great many people to relieve suffering, using the best available understanding of the body, which happened to be mistaken. The gap between what care intends and what care achieves is the oldest problem in the whole business, and it has never once been closed, only narrowed unevenly by people who mostly did not live to see it. In the long hall on the island and in several hundred rooms scattered across the city that night, the commonest crisis of all was beginning. It killed more women in this century than any war ever did, and no physician in Paris would have attended one for any money. There are more people in the room than the room was built to hold, and somebody has built the fire up in the middle of the afternoon. That is deliberate. A birth chamber was kept warm and kept dark, shuttered against drafts and against the light, and it was crowded on purpose. The midwife and the neighbor women, and whatever female relatives could be got there in time. The exact mechanics of what they did have to be reconstructed partly from later sources, because nobody in this century thought the details worth writing down. What is not in doubt is the composition of the room. No physician, no surgeon, no husband. Birth was women's business from beginning to end, attended by women who had done it before, and the professional half of medicine that we have just spent a chapter on had no part in it whatsoever and did not want one. Who is allowed into that room has been renegotiated in every century since, and it has never once been settled on medical grounds. The midwife brought hands, oil, and experience. She had delivered a great many children in that parish, and she knew which women had had trouble before. She brought prayers and relics if she could get them, and the belt or the girdle of a saint if the parish had one to lend, because the line between what we would call medicine and what we would call religion did not exist in that room and would have made no sense to anyone in it. And she brought one other thing, which is the most remarkable fact in this chapter. She could baptize. In a church that guarded its sacraments jealously, that required years of training and ordination and a bishop's hands for the men who administered them, there was a permanent standing exception, and it lived in the birth chamber. If a child was born alive and looked unlikely to survive the hour, and there was no priest to be had, the midwife, a laywoman, unordained, very often unable to read, could pour the water and say the words, and the baptism was valid, fully valid. Not a provisional measure to be redone properly later. The reason is stark. An infant who died unbaptized was believed to be shut out of heaven, and the church would very much rather that a washerwoman performed the rite badly in a hot room than that a soul was lost on a technicality of jurisdiction. So the words mattered enormously, and the water mattered, and priests were instructed to make sure the women of their parish knew the correct form, so that when it was needed, there would be no fumbling and no doubt afterwards about whether it had counted. The permission has never been withdrawn, incidentally. In an emergency under the same church, any person at all may still do it. What none of it could reach was the mother. Death in childbirth was common enough that everyone had seen it, and it fell on women of every rank, because the things that kill in childbirth are not much impressed by money. Nobody in this city had a figure for it, and nor do we. What we can see is the shape of the consequence, which shows up in something that looks, at first, like an unrelated subject. Around the year 1256, a physician from Siena working in the south of France wrote a book about how to keep a household healthy, what to eat, how to sleep, how to raise children, what to do about a cough. He wrote it in French, not Latin, which makes it one of the earliest medical works in the language, and he wrote it for a noblewoman, which means he expected it to be read by somebody who was not a physician and had no intention of becoming one. His name was Aldobrandino. On feeding an infant, his position is that the mother's own milk is best. He would not have needed to say so if it were what usually happened. Milk moved around in this society constantly, and it moved at every level of it. At the top, wet nurses were hired, lived in, and were paid. The figures for those wages that circulate in popular accounts are borrowed from centuries later and are not worth repeating. Everywhere else it was informal and immediate. A woman died or fell ill or her milk failed, and the child went to whoever in the street or the household was feeding one of her own. A poor infant in this city was about as likely as a rich one to be nursed by a woman who had not borne it. That was not a class arrangement. It was a survival arrangement, and it ran in every direction. A great many of those children died anyway, and this is the point at which we should be careful, because it is where the confident numbers come in. The figure most people have heard is that life expectancy in the Middle Ages was somewhere around 35, and it is one of the most misleading true statements in popular history. It is an average, and averages are demolished by deaths at the very bottom of the range. Where a large proportion of children die before 5, the mean is dragged down so far that it stops describing anybody's actual life. A Parisian who reached 20 in this city had a perfectly reasonable prospect of reaching 60, and there were old people everywhere, and everyone knew some. What we cannot do is tell you the rate. Parish registers, the documents that make that kind of arithmetic possible, do not exist here for another 2.5 centuries. We know from wills, from chronicles, from bequests, and from the sheer weight of testimony that a great many children died young in this city. Any percentage attached to Paris in the 1250s has been imported from somewhere else and dressed up in local clothes. The ones who lived were bound. Swaddling was universal. Wrapped firm, arms in, on the reasoning that a growing body needed to be held straight. And they were unwrapped and cleaned and rewrapped several times a day and set in a cradle that somebody had made or inherited. They also played, which needs saying because the opposite has been asserted so often. There are surviving toys, little pottery figures, model animals, whistles, tiny cooking vessels made for small hands, spinning tops. There are moralists complaining about the noise children made in church, and there is an enormous quantity of grief in the record. Parents endowing masses for dead infants, naming them in wills, marking the day. The claim that people did not become attached to their children because so many died does not survive contact with what people actually wrote down. Anyone who has watched a very small child work out how a thing opens knows the part of this that does not change at all. What changed early was work. Children in a craft household were useful from the age of 5 or 6, fetching, holding, sorting, carrying, minding a younger one. And by 10 or 12, a great many of them were doing something that would now be called a job. It was not an apprenticeship to life in any warm sense. It was labor. It was tiring, and it was done by people who were tired. And when it ended, in whatever year it ended, there was a place for them to go. Most parishes had a churchyard. A good many did not, or had one that had filled generations ago, and for those there was a large burial ground on the right bank near the market. By this century, it had given up on individual graves entirely. Bodies went into a common pit, a very large one holding something in the order of 1,500, which was left open and added to until it was full, and then closed, and then another was begun. A wall about 10 feet high stood around the whole enclosure. The dead of the hospital on the island went there too, when there was nowhere else. You can stand on that ground now. It is a small square with a 16th century fountain in the middle of it. And there are shops, which leaves a question that we should put rather than answer, because the answer is not ours to give. What are we to make of a city that buried its poor 1,500 at a time in an open pit, and that also handed a permanent, irrevocable sacramental power to any midwife in any back room, so that no single infant would be lost for want of 8 words and a cup of water? Both are true. They were held by the same people at the same time, and from the inside there was no contradiction in them at all. The soul was the thing that mattered, and the soul was individual. and irreplaceable. The body was a container which would be raised again whole at the end of everything, regardless of where it had been kept in the meantime. And where it was kept in the meantime was therefore a practical question about space. That is not our arrangement of the world, and we are not obliged to adopt it. It is worth understanding before deciding what to think of it. The pit was opened when it was needed, and closed when it was full. And what governed how fast it filled, more than plague, more than hunger, more than anything else in an ordinary decade, was simply the time of year. The light goes early here, and it goes earlier than the body ever quite believes. Paris sits far enough north that the difference between the ends of the year is not a matter of degree. On a day near midsummer, the sun is up for something over 16 hours. On a day near midwinter, it is up for a little over 8, and the usable part of that, the part with enough light in it to see fine work by, is shorter still at both ends, because a low sun in a narrow street between overhanging houses does not reach the ground for much of the time. It is technically in the sky. Anyone who has come out of a building at 4:30 on a December afternoon and found the day already finished has the physical fact of it. It has not changed. The only thing that has changed is what it costs, because this is a city that runs on daylight, and not only as a practical matter. We have already seen that most of the trades of Paris were forbidden by their own written rules to work after dark, on the stated ground that lamplight was not good enough to work honestly by. In June, that rule costs a craftsman nothing at all. There is more light than he can use. In December, it takes half his working day away from him, and there is no appeal against it. Halve the hours, and you halve the output, and halve the output, and you halve what comes in. And it arrives at exactly the moment when everything starts costing more. Fuel is bought here, not gathered, and in December, every household in the city wants it at once, and the price does what prices do. Light has to be bought as well. Candles or oil that nobody needed in June, burned at both ends of a day that has shrunk in the middle. Food is dearer because nothing is growing, and what there is has been sitting in a store since autumn and is diminishing visibly. Income down and expenditure up in the same weeks, every year, entirely predictably, and no household in this city was ever surprised by it, and a great many of them could do nothing about it. That is the particular arithmetic of the season, and it is worth sitting with, because it is the arithmetic that governed most lives in most of Europe for most of history. Some of it could be worked around. The trades that had bargained their way out of the nightwork rule. The goldsmiths, the barrel makers, the men who made mail shirts, could keep the lamps going. And the winter is precisely when that privilege turned from a matter of status into money. Indoor work fared better than outdoor. Spinning and sewing and weaving can be done by a poor light, badly, and a great deal of what was made in a Paris December was made badly for exactly that reason, which is one more thing the sworn men walking the shops were looking for. Other trades simply stopped. Building is seasonal, and it stops for the frost. Mortar will not set in the cold. A wall laid in December and caught by a hard freeze before it cures will fail, and every mason knew it. So the tops of unfinished walls were packed with straw and dung and covered over against the weather, and the great work on the island went quiet for months. The chisels that had been going all day, every working day, in the ears of everyone living in the shadow of the cathedral, went silent. And the 200 masons of this city had to be somewhere else, doing something else, until the ground softened. The river also changed character. We have seen that everything this city eats and burns and builds with arrives by water. In winter and into the spring, that arrangement becomes unreliable. High water takes out the crossings. The bridges of Paris were carried away by floods more than once in this century, houses, shops, and all. And a river running hard is a river that boats cannot come up. When the water was low with ice, nothing moved either. The season that cut a household's income in half was the same season that could interrupt the supply line, and both of those things could happen in the same fortnight. Just outside the wall, meanwhile, the vines were being pruned. There were working vineyards within sight of this city, and in some cases very nearly against it. Monks tending something like 15 hectares of them on the high ground to the north, and vines to the west, whose wine went across the river to the hospital for the sick. That is worth holding on to, because we tend to imagine a medieval town as a hard edge with a wall around it, and farmland starting somewhere out of sight. It was nothing like that. You could walk out of a gate, past the last houses, and be among vines within a few minutes. And the men working them in January were doing it in the cold with a short knife, cutting back last year's growth so that this year's would come, which is skilled work and cannot be hurried and cannot be postponed. Winter did most of the killing in a place like this, and it is worth saying plainly, because it does not look like history. History remembers the famine years and the plague years and the years when a river rose high enough to be written down. What actually did the steady, continuous work of reducing the population of European cities was an ordinary cold February. A shuttered room with the air unchanged for weeks, damp in the walls and damp in the bedding, food that had been in a store too long, no clean way to get both warm and dry at once, and a chest infection moving through a household where everyone slept together for the heat. The old went, and the very small went, and the ones who had been ill in the autumn and had not quite come back, went. None of that gets into a chronicle because nothing happened. There is no event. A chronicler notes a siege, a flood, a comet, a king. He does not note that it was a hard January, and that the parish buried rather more people than usual, because there is nothing to note. It was January, and it was hard, and it always is. We cannot give you a figure for it in Paris in the 1250s, for the same reason we could not give you one for infants. The documents that would let us count are 3 centuries away. What we can say is that the great burial pit on the right bank filled faster between January and March than in any other quarter of the year, and that everybody in this city knew that, and that nobody thought it remarkable. Anyone who has been genuinely cold for a long stretch, rather than briefly, knows the thing that the accounts do not manage to convey. It stops being a sensation somewhere in the second week and becomes a way of thinking. It narrows what you are willing to consider. It makes the walk to the well an argument you have with yourself. And it is very hard to be generous or patient or interested in anything at all while it is going on. That is the condition Routebeuf was writing out of, whatever else he was doing with it, and it is where we leave him. A man in a cold room in this city, turning the cold into something he could sell, which is not the worst answer anybody has found to it. The dark itself was the other half, not dimness, not a city with its lights on in the distance. 16 hours in which the only light anywhere is what somebody is deliberately burning, indoors behind a shutter, and outside in the lanes between the overhanging houses, an absence so complete that a person could stand at the end of his own street and not be able to tell whether anyone was in it. A city of tens of thousands of people packed shoulder to shoulder inside a wall in the pitch dark for 2/3 of the day. Something has to happen at that hour, and something did, and it happened every single night. The last cries of the day are for things you burn. Charcoal first, because a fire has to be got through the night, and the night is long. Then candles, called through streets that are already going dim, to people who have spent the afternoon deciding whether they can afford one. Then a man buying rather than selling, old metalware worn out, broken, going door to door for whatever anybody wants rid of, because nothing made of metal in this city is ever simply thrown away. And last of all, when the selling is essentially over, a man comes through with thin, sweet wafers. That is where the poem stops. A jongleur sat down at some point in the 1260s and set the cries of Paris into verse in the order he heard them, beginning before dawn with the baths and ending here in the dark, with somebody offering something sweet to whoever is still out. He does not say what happens after that, because after that there is nothing to cry. The gates go first. 12 of them shut and barred, and anybody still on the road outside will be spending the night against the wall, as people have been doing since the wall went up. Then the chains come out, drawn across the mouths of streets, stretched over the water, and a city that has been entirely open all day divides itself into sections that can be defended, or at least accounted for. The watch forms out of whoever's turn it is. A weaver, a shoemaker, somebody's journeyman, 3 weeks at a stretch, unpaid, with a stick and a lantern, having worked a full day and facing another one in the morning. They are not soldiers and were never meant to be. They are the men who live here, taking turns to stay awake so that everybody else does not have to. Every city still has this hour, and it still arrives the same way, not all at once, but in a sequence, trade by trade, street by street, until at some point nobody can say exactly when it happened. Then the bell. The name of that bell is the reason we have a word. It comes from the old instruction, cover the fire. And the instruction was literal: rake the embers together, bank them under their own ash, and leave nothing burning in the open in a city built of oak. It is the single most sensible rule in medieval urban life, and it saved this place more times than anyone counted. But by this century, the word had already slipped. Nobody hearing that bell thought of it as being told what to do with their hearth. It had become the name of an hour, the time the bell rang, the time the chains went up, the time you were expected to be indoors. And the fire had dropped out of it entirely. The word had outlived the act it described, which is what words do, and it went on outliving it for another 800 years, and is still in use in languages spoken by people who have never banked an ember in their lives. Inside, the closing down is small and quick, the fire raked and covered, which we have watched 100 times by now, the shutter pulled to, the last candle out because a candle is money, and the money has been spent, and then a bed with several people in it, because warmth is a resource and sharing is how you get more of it. The particular quality of a room in which the last light has just gone out and there is no other light anywhere in any direction for miles. Of all of it, this is what came through. 2 leaves of parchment with the cries on them in a library. A stone on the south side of the cathedral with a mason's name and the month of February in it, cut while he was alive and still legible. The line of the wall which is gone, surviving as the reason certain streets bend where they bend. The name of a fortress, attached now to a square and to a railway station under it. A chapel with its original glass still in the windows. A hospital that was founded for 300 blind people and is still, after everything, dealing in eyes. And a ship on the arms of the city, which began as a shipping cartel's badge and is now simply what Paris looks like. 2 of those you could go and stand in front of this week. Set against what there was, it is almost nothing. The men who carried grain up the gravel, the women who spun silk until their eyes went, the porters and the water carriers and the watch and the students and the half of this city that was poor. Not one name among them, apart from the handful who happened to be asked about a miracle 26 years later and had to give their circumstances to a clerk in order to be believed. That is the ordinary ratio. A city of tens of thousands of people running for a decade, and what it left was a poem, a signature, some bent streets and a coat of arms. And still, this is the thing worth holding at the end. It was enough. Enough to stand in a lane at dawn and know what was being shouted. Enough to know what a bath cost, and who was allowed to work after dark, and what two people had to say to be married, and which floor of the prison you ended up on if you had no money. None of that was written down for us. All of it was written down for some entirely practical reason by somebody with a job to do, and it survived by accident, and it turns out to be the shape of a world. We cannot do anything for these people. They cannot be helped, and they cannot be harmed, and nothing we conclude about them will reach them. The only thing still available is to look, slowly, and with some care, and without deciding in advance that it was better or worse than it was. That is not much. It is also the entire difference between a century that is remembered and one that is merely over. Whatever else is true tonight, the cold in that room is not your cold, and it has not been anybody's cold for a very long time. The morning began with a man shouting that the water was hot. The day has ended with another one selling sweet wafers in the dark to whoever is still out to hear him, and then he stops as well and goes home, and there is nothing left being called anywhere in Paris. The gates are barred, the chains are across the streets. In several thousand rooms, the fires have been raked together and covered over, and they will hold until morning. On the island, on a wall that will still be standing in 800 years, a man's name is cut into the stone, and the letters are sharp, and nobody is awake to read them. The city is dark. It has been dark a very long time. Sleep well.